What ancient memory first whispered to these wandering peoples, guiding them south toward the lakes of a future empire? They say every people carries a beginning, an origin not measured in dates or coordinates, but in stories. For the ancestors of the Mexica, that beginning was Aztlan, a name spoken softly across centuries, drifting like wind through canyons, a memory preserved not in geography but in feeling. It was remembered as a place of shimmering waters and calm mornings, where reeds swayed at the edge of a vast lake, and where early Nahua-speaking peoples lived in quiet harmony before their long journey south. Aztlan appears in later codices as an island surrounded by gentle waters, crowned by white herons and distant hills. Whether such a place ever existed is less important than what it represented. In the imagination of the Mexica, Aztlan was the place before struggle, before wandering, before empire. It was the first breath of their story, a place of innocence that would stand in contrast to the trials that followed. Yet beneath this mythic imagery lies a deeper historical echo. Archaeology and linguistics suggest that long before the rise of the Aztec Triple Alliance, waves of Nahua-speaking peoples gradually moved southward from the deserts and highlands of northwestern Mesoamerica. These were landscapes of sharp light and long horizons, thorn forests, dry lake beds, seasonal rivers that vanished without warning. Life here demanded adaptability. Communities traveled lightly, responding to shifting climates, resource scarcity, and the rise and fall of neighboring cultures. To later generations, these centuries of movement condensed into a single, unified memory, Aztlan. A homeland simplified into symbol. A reminder of who they were before they became who they would be. The peoples who remembered Aztlan were not yet the Mexica. They were not yet the founders of Tenochtitlan or the architects of vast marketplaces and rising pyramids. They were small, interwoven communities, speaking early forms of Nahuatl, carrying traditions shaped by long contact with other northern cultures, Shishimec hunters, Oasis America traders, and the remnants of older sedentary societies that had risen and fallen across the deserts. In the Mexica worldview, history was cyclical, layered, and alive. Myth and memory intertwined without contradiction. Aztlan, then, was not a fixed point but a mirror through which the past could be understood. It anchored identity in a time when the people themselves were still in motion. Later chroniclers, writing after the founding of Tenochtitlan, would describe Aztlan as peaceful, orderly, and blessed with abundance. It was a place where the early ancestors lived without hardship, guided by tradition and protected by the gods. In these recollections, we glimpse the emotional truth of the origin legend, an idealized memory of stability before the long trials of migration reshaped the people into something new. But across the centuries, the meaning of Aztlan expanded. It became the symbolic north, the Mictlampa, the region associated with beginnings and with the mysterious, the direction of wind, death, and rebirth in Mesoamerican cosmology. Aztlan's placement in the north elevated it from a simple birthplace to a cosmic point of orientation, linking the Mexica not just to geography, but to the deeper structure of the universe. Even in the codices, the name carries a poetic quality. Aztlan may derive from Aztecs, meaning heron, a bird associated with purity and stillness. Scholars have imagined the place of the herons, or perhaps the place of whiteness. But names travel through centuries like river stones, smoothed, reshaped, whispered, never quite the same twice. The meaning remains elusive, suspended between language, memory, and myth. What is certain is that the peoples who preserved this story were never isolated. They lived in a world of shifting alliances and cultural exchange, borrowing agricultural techniques, religious ideas, and artistic traditions from neighbors across Mesoamerica. Their journey, whether gradual or guided by prophecy, connected them to distant trade routes, old ceremonial centers, and the fading legacies of civilizations long declined, like the Toltecs of Tula. To imagine Aztlan is to picture a seed carried by wandering hands, a memory that traveled from desert shores to river valleys, from makeshift camps to fortified hilltops, always changing, always alive. As generations moved southward, this memory served as a narrative compass. It told them they came from a place of harmony, that their wandering had purpose, and that the trials ahead were part of a destiny older than any one community. For the Mexica, who arrived late in the Valley of Mexico's long history, this memory became especially important. Among established city-states like Texcoco and Culhuacan, lineage and ancient origin stories were markers of legitimacy. By anchoring themselves to Aztlan, the Mexica aligned their identity with antiquity, resilience, and divine sanction. Yet even stripped of politics, Aztlan remains a quiet, powerful symbol, a reminder that civilizations do not emerge fully formed but accumulate slowly through movement, through landscapes crossed, hardships endured, and stories retold at firesides where elders spoke of the place where their people first knew themselves. This is why Aztlan opens the story of the Aztec world, not as a literal map point, but as a doorway into understanding how memory guided a people across centuries of change. The mythic North is both a beginning and a direction, one that shaped the journeys ahead. And as these memories traveled with each generation, the long migration from myth into history quietly began. What subtle forces push a people across mountains and valleys, long before they dream of cities or kings? Long before the Mexica appeared at the edge of the Valley of Mexico, the lands to the north were already alive with movement. Across deserts, plateaus, and scattered oases, Nahua-speaking peoples drifted slowly southward for centuries, family by family, village by village, leaving behind the rugged landscapes of their ancestors and following pathways carved by necessity, opportunity, and the quiet pull of time itself. Their migrations were not dramatic marches led by conqueror kings or driven by the roar of armies. They were quieter, gentler currents of humanity. Children walking beside loaded travois, elders leaning on staffs as they crossed pale grasslands, traders scanning the horizon for the next trickle of water. These were movements measured in seasons, not moments, centuries of adaptation that gradually redrew the cultural map of Mesoamerica. Archaeologists trace these migrations broadly from the 6th to the 13th centuries, a long era of environmental shifts and political realignments. Northern Mesoamerica, stretching through the modern states of Durango, Zacatecas, and Jalisco, experienced fluctuating rainfall and episodes of drought. Rivers narrowed, once reliable springs became unpredictable, and fertile valleys shrank. Communities that had farmed maize or gathered wild resources found themselves pressured to move, not abruptly, but gradually, in waves that pulsed southward over generations. At the same time, the cultural landscape of central and southern Mesoamerica was changing. The collapse of Teotihuacan around the 6th century opened vast new spaces in the basin of Mexico and beyond. Once stable networks of tribute, trade, and political authority dissolved. What remained was a mosaic of independent settlements, each competing for farmland, resources, and influence. Into this shifting world, the Nahua migrants slowly entered. They were not a single people but many groups, speaking related languages and carrying variations of shared traditions. Some settled for decades in one valley before moving on. Others intermarried with local cultures, Otomi farmers, remnants of earlier Teotihuacano communities, and groups with deep roots in the Central Highlands. Over time, these mixtures created new identities, new dialects, and eventually new political lineages that would shape the destiny of the region. As these communities moved, they carried with them more than belongings. They brought cosmologies, origin stories, ritual practices, and a deep belief that movement itself was part of the human experience. For many, their ancestors were thought to have wandered before them, guided by divine signs or ancestral obligations. Migration was not simply a response to hardship. It was woven into cultural memory. Archaeological evidence hints at the rhythm of this movement. Pueblo-like dwellings appear in one region only to vanish a century later. Ceramics characteristic of northern styles begin to surface farther south. Tools, burial practices, and artistic motifs gradually shift across broad distances. Settlement layers show periods of occupation followed by abandonment, then reused by new groups with subtly different traditions. Through these patterns, the story of migration becomes visible, not in written records, but in the silent testimony of the earth. Among the many Nahua groups moving south, the Mexica were only one small community. Their name would someday be spoken with reverence and fear, but at this early stage they were simply wanderers among many others. They traveled with limited resources, relying on hunting, simple agriculture, and the generosity or tolerance of settled peoples. Their identity would form slowly, shaped by each place they paused, each culture they encountered, and each hardship they survived. Other groups, such as the Acalua, the Tepanica, and the Culhua, were also migrating or redefining themselves during this era. Some arrived earlier and established footholds that would later blossom into major city-states. Others absorbed influences from Toltec descendants or adopted the political traditions of older Central Mexican polities. The result was a vast cultural blending that made the Basin of Mexico one of the most diverse and dynamic regions in the pre-Columbian world. These migrations were not constant motion. Families often stopped for years or generations at small springs, fertile plains, or defensible hillsides. They planted maize, gathered maguey fiber, hunted deer, and crafted pottery. Children grew up believing their settlement was permanent, until shifting conditions, conflict with neighbors, or sacred signs urged them onward again. In this way, migration became a rhythm of life, a cycle of settling, adapting, and moving, carried forward by both necessity and tradition. Some communities who arrived in central Mexico adopted older structures of governance, building councils of nobles, priests, and warriors. Others developed new political systems influenced by Toltec mythology and the fragmented world left in the wake of Tula's decline. These evolving structures would become the foundations of the city-states, Itzcoatl, that later dominated the Aztec world. Within this larger tapestry, the Mexica remained one thread among many. They were latecomers, culturally connected to northern traditions but increasingly shaped by the lands they traversed. They learned from more established peoples, absorbed their agricultural methods, and adopted their styles of worship. Yet they also held tightly to their own memories, stories of Aztlan, of ancestral wanderings, and of a destiny not yet revealed. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the great movement that had begun centuries earlier was approaching its final destination. Nahua-speaking peoples were now deeply intertwined with the politics of central Mexico, establishing alliances, forming rivalries, and founding settlements across valleys and lockshores. The stage was set for the emergence of new powers. The Mexica, still without a permanent home, continued their long journey, carrying with them the memory of Aztlan and the habits of a people shaped by generations of wandering. These meandering paths would eventually converge on a single basin, a place of lakes and islands where destiny waited. How does a small, displaced community find its place in a valley already rich with ancient power? After generations of wandering, the Mexica finally approached the place that would reshape their destiny, the Valley of Mexico. Seen from a distance, it was a vast high-altitude bowl, cradled by volcanic mountains that stood like ancient sentinels. White peaks in winter, dark silhouettes at dusk. The air was crisp, thinner than the northern plains they had known, and the sky seemed to hold a quiet brilliance, as though the sun lingered longer above these heights. But it was not the mountains that defined this valley. It was water. At its center stretched a broad system of interconnected lakes: Texcoco, Xochimilco, Chalco, Zumpango, and Xaltecan, shimmering like silver plates under the midday light. Marshlands fringed their edges, weaving into a labyrinth of reeds, narrow channels, and islands formed by nature and by centuries of human engineering. Canoes glided along these waterways like slow-moving shadows. Birds circled overhead. Fishermen cast nets into shallow coves where the water turned still and reflective. The Mexica, stepping into this landscape for the first time, were not arriving at an empty world. Civilization had long taken root here. The valley was home to powerful and ancient city-states. Itzcoatl, meaning water mountain, a term that captured the intimate bond between geography and identity. Each city-state was a self-contained world, complete with noble lineages, priestly schools, bustling marketplaces, and armies ready to defend their fields and canals. To the south stood Culhuacan, a city proud of its Toltec heritage, guarding traditions that stretched back to the legendary metropolis of Tula. On the eastern shores lay Texcoco, a rising power that would later become renowned for poetry, law, and scholarship. To the northwest stood Azcapotzalco, seat of the Tepanica, a militaristic state that exerted influence over much of the valley through tribute and controlled warfare. These were societies with deep memories. Their canals, temples, and roads bore the weight of centuries. Their dynasties were established, their alliances old and layered. Compared to them, the Mexica were latecomers, strangers arriving at the edge of a mature geopolitical landscape. As they entered the valley, the Mexica were land-poor and politically marginal. They possessed no noble credentials recognized by other states, no ancestral claim to prized farmlands, and no permanent settlement. Their long migration had hardened them, shaped them into resilient people skilled in hunting, agriculture, and warfare. Yet within the valley, these strengths were not enough to grant them immediate status. They were viewed with suspicion and sometimes disdain, northern outsiders whose customs seemed rough, whose destiny was uncertain. Still, the valley's wealth offered opportunities. Its lake shores held fertile soils ideal for maize, amaranth, and beans. Its marshes provided fish, waterfowl, and edible plants that could sustain even communities without farmland. And more importantly, the constant rivalries between city-states created a demand for mercenaries, skilled warriors who could be hired to strengthen one army against another. The Mexica, trained by generations of hardship, found a place in this competitive world as soldiers for hire. This was the beginning of their slow entry into the valley's political fabric. Serving more powerful states allowed them to observe the mechanisms of tribute systems, alliances, and ritual warfare. They learned how noble houses negotiated marriages, how markets operated, and how agricultural calendars were aligned with religious ceremonies. In these experiences, a new understanding began to form, an understanding of how cities held power, how rulers maintained authority, and how ritual shaped daily life. But their status remained precarious. Without land, they were pushed to settle in marginal areas, scrubby patches of shoreline, mosquito-ridden marshlands, or abandoned plots between larger settlements. Their first encampments were temporary, made of woven reeds and simple huts. Their children played at the edges of other people's fields. Their elders remembered Aztlan quietly while helping gather reeds for mats, firewood, or the simple rafts needed to navigate the lakes. And yet, within the Mexica communities, there was also a quiet determination. They had survived deserts, droughts, and long years of wandering. The valley's challenges, though formidable, were not beyond their resilience. They adapted quickly to life on the water, learning to fish with nets and traps, to harvest insects and reeds, and eventually to cultivate plots in the marshland itself. This adaptability is one of the calm discoveries historians often make when studying their early presence in the valley. The Mexica were not simply shaped by the valley. They responded to it with remarkable creativity. They learned to build the earliest versions of what would later become chinampas, the floating fields that transformed lake water into fertile soil. They learned to navigate intricate political relationships with patience, observing dynastic rivalries with the attentiveness of people who understood that future opportunities would arise in times of unrest. Another gentle insight emerges from archaeology. Even in this period of hardship, the Mexica carried forward traditions from their northern journeys, ceremonial objects, styles of pottery, and ways of telling their story. Their identity did not dissolve into the valley. It adjusted, but endured. By the late 13th century, the Mexica were slowly weaving themselves into the valley's social and political tapestry. They were still outsiders, still reliant on the goodwill or strategic needs of more powerful neighbors, but they had now entered the place where their wandering past would meet its turning point. The lakes shimmered beneath the sun, reflecting a world of opportunity and peril. The mountains watched silently, and the Mexica, poised between memory and possibility, prepared to seek the next sign that would guide them toward permanence. And it was here, in these waters, that the Mexica would search for a sign, a quiet omen that would anchor their wandering past to a new home. What vision transforms a marsh into the heart of an empire? For generations, the Mexica had wandered through valleys and along lake shores, searching for signs that would anchor their story. They had served other kingdoms, fought in other armies, and lived at the margins of more powerful Itzcoatl. Yet through every movement and encampment, their elders carried a memory, the promise that one day, their journey would end at a place marked by a divine omen. According to their tradition, the sign would be unmistakable. An eagle perched upon a cactus, clutching or devouring a serpent, rising out of the waters of the lake. It was a vision bound to Huitzilopochtli, their patron deity, whose voice echoed through ritual memory and whose guidance had shaped their long migration from the mythic north. Much of the omen's meaning is symbolic, and historians see layers of interpretation in it. The eagle as the sun, the cactus as the land reclaimed from water, the serpent as life force or earthly challenge. But to the Mexica, encountering the omen was not metaphor alone. It was confirmation that their wandering had purpose. At last, sometime in the early 14th century, they found it. The island that greeted them was small, marshy, and seemingly inhospitable. It was not the lush farmland they had hoped for, nor did it lie on a major trade route. Reeds pressed in from every direction, and the lakebed beneath their feet shifted with each movement. Yet on this patch of mud and water, surrounded by shallows shimmering in the sun, the sacred sign appeared. Whether seen in vision, ritual, or as a later mythologized memory, it carried a clarity that resonated through every member of the community. Here they believed their wandering would end. The practical realities were daunting. The Mexica were choosing to settle on land that other city-states had overlooked precisely because it was difficult to cultivate and easy to isolate. This island required ingenuity simply to sustain life. Fresh water was scarce, dry land nearly non-existent, and seasonal floods could transform stable ground into soft channels overnight. Yet perhaps because of these challenges, the Mexica saw opportunity. They would no longer be at the mercy of powerful neighbors controlling fertile land or established roads. By choosing this fringe of the lake, they claimed a space that no other polity sought, a space where they could grow on their own terms. The earliest days of Tenochtitlan were modest, almost fragile. Families erected huts from reeds and wood, stabilizing them on firm patches of ground or platforms of piled mud. Canoes became essential tools, used for fishing, gathering plants, and moving between emergent islands. Smoke curled from the first cooking fires, drifting across the mirror-like water. Children played at the edge of the marsh, their laughter echoing softly across the reeds. Nights were cool, accompanied by the distant calls of birds and the gentle lapping of water against newly built dwellings. But necessity sparked innovation. The Mexica quickly developed systems to reclaim land using a method they would master over generations. Chinampas. These agricultural plots were formed by weaving reeds into rectangular frames, anchoring them with stakes, and gradually filling the inner spaces with mud, sediment, and decaying vegetation. Over time, the floating frames solidified into fertile, stable fields. On these chinampas, maize, beans, squash, and flowering plants thrived in the nutrient-rich soil. The calm discovery emerging from this period is that chinampa agriculture was not only efficient, it was ecological. The constant renewal of lake sediment created a cycle of fertility unmatched by traditional dryland farming. Water channels between the plots allowed easy transportation and supported fish and waterfowl. This blend of agriculture and aquaculture would eventually sustain a city of hundreds of thousands. As they expanded their chinampas, the Mexica also began shaping a more permanent settlement. They built wooden causeways to connect their island to the mainland during dry seasons. These walkways were simple at first, little more than raised paths of packed earth and timber, yet they marked the earliest steps toward transforming the marsh into something structured. They connected communities, allowed for trade, and provided escape routes during floods. Social organization developed in parallel with the city's physical growth. Families grouped into calpuli, or neighborhood clans, each responsible for shared land, communal obligations, and rituals honoring their own patron deities. Leadership roles emerged gradually, shaped by the community's needs. Priests who oversaw ceremonies, warriors who protected the settlement, and elders who mediated disputes and maintained genealogical memory. In these early years, the Mexica were not yet the imperial people they would become. They were a community holding itself together through cooperation, resilience, and a shared belief in the significance of their new home. Another gentle insight from this period lies in how the Mexica understood their environment. The marshland was not an obstacle but a teacher. It required patience, observation, and respect. They learned how water flowed through the lake channels at different seasons, how reeds could reinforce embankments, and how volcanic soil carried downstream could enrich chinampa beds. Every improvement was the result of careful attention, a partnership between human effort and natural rhythms. As the settlement gradually expanded, the island began to feel less like a fragile outpost and more like a living center. Small shrines appeared, dedicated to gods who had guided their travels. Canoe traffic increased. The chinampas grew more orderly, forming a patchwork of green fields that contrasted with the deep blue of the waterways. Even in its earliest form, Tenochtitlan carried a hint of the grandeur it would one day achieve. A city rising from water, shaped by human faith and ingenuity. Yet these beginnings remained humble. There were no great pyramids yet, no palaces decorated with stone carvings or murals. What existed was determination. A belief that this unlikely island, found through omen and faith, could sustain a future. And slowly, season by season, it did. From these muddy foundations, the first threads of political identity quietly began to weave. How does a young community choose leaders when its future is still fragile and undefined? In the earliest years of Tenochtitlan, when the huts still clung to the edges of the marsh and the chinampas were only beginning to knit soil from water, the Mexica faced a question that would shape the course of their new settlement. Who would guide them? The community had endured migration, servitude, and marginality, but the founding of a permanent home required something different. Leadership rooted not in wandering, but in place. The first figure to rise from this moment was Tenoch, remembered in tradition as a priestly leader whose wisdom offered stability during the transition from migrant band to settled Itzcoatl. Little is known of his life, yet his name echoes in both memory and myth, suggesting a person who embodied spiritual authority more than political command. Under Tenoch, the community formed its earliest rituals around the island's sacred spaces, honoring Huitzilopochtli and the ancestors who had guided them southward. These rituals, quiet and persistent, helped unify the calpuli, the clan-based groups that had traveled together for generations. Each calpuli retained its own customs, kinship ties, and economic responsibilities, but the shift to a permanent settlement required cooperation across these boundaries. Tenoch's leadership offered a center of gravity, a calm voice that helped align daily life with shared belief. Under his guidance, the Mexica began to think of themselves not only as migrating families, but as residents of a single place. Yet as the city grew slowly, steadily, another need emerged. Tenochtitlan, poised on a fragile island within a competitive valley, could not exist without diplomacy. To survive among powerful neighbors like Texcoco, Culhuacan, and Azcapotzalco, the Mexica required a ruler whose authority was recognized beyond their own borders. This necessity led to a pivotal decision. The community would elect a Tlatoani, a speaker ruler, whose lineage would carry political weight. Their choice revealed much about their aspirations. They selected Aqueducts, a young man with ties to the noble houses of Culhuacan, a lineage believed to descend from the Toltecs, the cultural precursors revered throughout central Mexico. By choosing him, the Mexica sought not only leadership but legitimacy. His selection was both practical and symbolic, a bridge to older traditions, a statement that Tenochtitlan was more than a camp on the water. Aqueduct's rule marked the beginning of Tenochtitlan's transformation. His leadership helped formalize the administrative structures that would define the city's early polity. The Calpuli, long the backbone of community life, became organized units responsible for local governance, military recruitment, and land allocation. Each had its own leaders and councils, yet they were now integrated into a broader framework under the Tlatonis' authority. In this way, a balance emerged, local autonomy supported by a centralized vision. The political order that formed under Aqueducts was modest compared to the imperial system of later centuries, but its foundations were essential. Land distribution was carefully managed to ensure stability. Tribute demands were small, reflecting the city's limited resources. Military obligations were coordinated but not yet expansive. And through it all, Aqueducts maintained relationships with nearby powers, acknowledging their strength while fostering space for Mexica growth. A calm discovery from this era is that leadership did not arise from domination, but from integration. The Mexica understood that their survival depended on cooperation, both within the city and beyond it. Their leaders navigated a delicate path, seeking to elevate Tenochtitlan without provoking larger neighbors who still viewed them as dependent newcomers. This period also saw the strengthening of social cohesion. Marriages between noble families helped connect the Mexica with circles of influence that stretched across the valley. Festivals and shared rituals reinforced unity. As the Chinampa fields expanded and the causeways improved, everyday life became more stable, and the sense of belonging deepened. Children born during this era would know Tenochtitlan not as a fragile experiment but as their true home. Another gentle insight lies in the nature of early governance itself. The Mexica were forming a polity where political, spiritual, and communal responsibilities all intertwined. The Tlatoni ruled not only through authority but through example, participating in ceremonies, overseeing public works, and guiding the city's moral and ritual life. Leadership was a lived presence, visible in the rhythm of the marketplace, the maintenance of canals, and the observance of seasonal rites. Aqueducts' rule concluded with a city still small, still overshadowed by the power of Azcapotzalco and other neighbors. Yet the transformation he guided was profound. He wove together disparate families into a unified polity. He gave the city a recognized lineage, connecting its future to the storied past of the Toltecs. And he established structures flexible enough to adapt as Tenochtitlan grew in size, influence, and ambition. By the end of his reign, the island settlement had become a true city-state, modest, yes, but rooted in identity and strengthened by leadership that blended tradition with newfound legitimacy. As the city organized itself, Tenochtitlan looked outward toward allies, rivals, and the shifting balance of the valley. For many years after their founding, the Mexica lived beneath the long shadow of Azcapotzalco, the powerful Tepanec capital whose armies, markets, and tribute networks shaped the political rhythm of the entire valley. The Mexica were not yet conquerors, not yet keepers of an empire. They were one community among many, young, ambitious, and painfully aware of their precarious position among older, stronger city-states. And so, for a time, their path bent toward service. Azcapotzalco had risen to prominence through a careful blend of military strength and economic control, demanding tribute from smaller cities, mediating disputes, and maintaining a network of alliances that kept its rivals in check. When the Mexica entered this sphere, they did so as dependents, offering labor, warriors, and loyalty in exchange for protection, and for the fragile legitimacy that a new city so desperately needed. The relationship was unequal, but it was also formative. In the quiet years of subordination, the Mexica learned lessons that would later define the shape of their own empire. Life under Tepanec rule shaped nearly every aspect of early Tenochtitlan. Young men served as porters, craftsmen, and soldiers, carrying goods along causeways or joining Tepanec campaigns in distant territories. Through these duties, they gained not only military experience but a wider understanding of the political landscape. Which towns resisted, which paid eagerly, which rebelled in silence. They saw the mechanisms of power working up close, how tribute was collected, how diplomacy was conducted, how punishments were enforced. In the calm passages of years spent under an overlord, the Mexica observed the tools of empire long before they wielded them themselves. The tribute system imposed by Azcapotzalco was demanding but predictable. Goods flowed through the valley: woven cloth, maize, obsidian blades, cacao, salt, feathers, and crafted ornaments, carried along ancient trade routes that connected city-state to city-state. For the Mexica, meeting these obligations required discipline and organization. Calpulli coordinated labor, households adjusted planting cycles, warriors trained for campaigns that were not always their own. While harsh, this structure strengthened the internal cohesion of the young city. It compelled them to refine administrative practices, to gather resources efficiently, and to cultivate a seriousness of purpose that would later echo through their own imperial policies. In the marshlands of Tenochtitlan, this period also reshaped identity. As warriors returned from Tepanec expeditions, they brought stories of distant frontiers, new tactics, and hard-earned honors. The Mexica were valued by Azcapotzalco not only for their loyalty but for their growing reputation as fierce fighters, a trait that would one day give them leverage against the very overlords they served. Beneath the quiet surface of obedience, strength was accumulating grain by grain. And yet, the relationship remained tense. As Tenochtitlan grew in population and economic capability, its ambitions began to stretch against the bounds imposed by Tepanec control. Markets on the island thrived, chinampa production expanded, religious ceremonies drew increasing crowds. Each success made the Mexica more confident and more difficult to contain. Azcapotzalco watched these changes with ambivalence. The young city was becoming useful, but also potentially dangerous. Still, for years the balance held. Tenochtitlan supplied warriors and tribute. Azcapotzalco granted permission for limited expansion and offered occasional political support. The arrangement resembled a young tree growing beneath a larger one, sheltered from storms, yet stunted by the canopy above. The Mexica understood that their survival depended on patience. They learned to navigate the subtleties of service, when to obey openly, when to negotiate quietly, when to offer strength, and when to withhold it. This period also forged the hardened discipline that would later define the Aztec military. Warfare became not only a duty but a path of honor. Ranks, rituals, and warrior societies slowly took shape. Training methods refined themselves through constant use. Though the campaigns were often waged for Tepanec benefit, the Mexica gained something too. A shared identity rooted in endurance, courage, and the belief that struggle itself could be sacred. But beneath the stillness lay fault lines. As Azcapotzalco grew more powerful, internal rivalries within the Tepanec elite deepened. Succession disputes simmered, alliances shifted, and whispers of dissatisfaction circulated among tributary states. The valley's delicate balance was beginning to strain. And in Tenochtitlan, leaders watched closely, sensing that change might come not through open rebellion, but through the fractures opening within the very empire they served. For now, though, the Mexica waited, sharpening their skills, strengthening their city, and learning from the political storms gathering across the lake. They did not yet know that one such storm would soon break the old order entirely. But they could feel it, like distant thunder rolling across the waters of Lake Texcoco. And from this pressure, a moment of fracture would soon appear, a shift that would alter the balance of every city around Lake Texcoco. By the early 1400s, the long-standing order of the Valley of Mexico had begun to shift. For generations, Azcapotzalco had stood at the center of regional power, its Tepanec rulers enforcing tribute, mediating alliances, and commanding obedience from the lakeside cities. The Mexica of Tenochtitlan, though growing stronger each year, still lived beneath this authority, supplying warriors and resources to sustain the Tepanec Empire. Yet beneath the calm surface of the valley, tensions were gathering, slow changes that would quietly reshape the political landscape. Tezozomoc, the aging and formidable Tepanec ruler, had maintained unity through a blend of diplomatic skill, fear, and reward. But as his life drew to a close, the harmony he had crafted began to fray. Tribute demands increased, placing heavier burdens on both old allies and reluctant subjects. Rivalries within the Tepanec elite sharpened, each faction wary of what might follow the old ruler's death. And across the lake, in the island city of Tenochtitlan, a different kind of watchfulness grew. The Mexica, once wanderers and dependents, had matured. They understood the valley's rhythms, its alliances and tensions, its fragile balances. And they sensed, with quiet clarity, that a moment of opportunity was approaching. When Tezozomoc died, the succession dispute he left behind opened the first cracks in Tepanec authority. His son Maxla, lacking both his father's prestige and political finesse, moved quickly to secure power. But his methods were sharp, alienating long-standing allies and turning suspicion into resentment. Texcoco, once an honored partner within the regional system, found itself threatened. Its prince, Nezahualcóyotl, was forced into exile, his family scattered or executed. Many expected Texcoco's influence to fade entirely, reduced to yet another tributary city under Tepanec enforcement. But exile did not destroy Nezahualcóyotl. Instead, it transformed him into a patient strategist, moving quietly among allies, gathering support in places where Tepanec demands had grown too heavy. And in Tenochtitlan, rising leaders watched Maxla's actions with increasing concern. Their obligations to Azcapotzalco remained, but now the cost felt different, less like partnership, more like tightening restraint. It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty that the Mexica made a decisive turn. Their ruler, Itzcoatl, a man of focused mind and steady will, recognized that the valley's balance had shifted. Tenochtitlan could no longer grow freely under Tepanec oversight, and Maxla's distrust of rising powers threatened their future security. Quiet meetings began. Leaders gathered on reed mats beneath dim torchlight, discussing risks and imagining possibilities that once felt unthinkable. The question was no longer whether they could resist the Tepanecs, but whether they could afford not to. The alliance that emerged between Tenochtitlan and the exiled Texcocan prince was built not on sudden rebellion but on careful understanding. Each side brought strengths the other needed. Tenochtitlan possessed a growing warrior class hardened by years of Tepanec campaigns. Texcoco held the cultural prestige and political connections of an older lineage. Together, they could challenge the authority that neither could oppose alone. And so, slowly, discreetly, messages were exchanged, support gathered, and plans formed. When open conflict finally began, it did not erupt in a single dramatic moment. Instead, it unfolded like a long, steady breath, the gradual tightening of resistance around Azcapotzalco. Small towns withdrew their loyalty. Supply lines became uncertain. Tepanec garrisons found themselves isolated. Under the cover of night, Mexica warriors slipped across the waters of Lake Texcoco, their canoes gliding silently through the reeds. Councils were held in hushed tones, strategies whispered beneath the soft crackle of torches. This was not war in its loudest form, but war conducted with patience, timing, and the understanding that each step mattered. Texcoco's supporters, once scattered, began to regroup under Nezahualcóyotl's leadership. The Mexica advanced with discipline, their years of service under Tepanec command now giving them insight into their enemy's strengths and weaknesses. Bit by bit, Azcapotzalco's grip loosened. Its allies sensed the change and hesitated. Its tributaries found new courage in the possibility of freedom. The final blows came not as a swift collapse, but as the culmination of months of pressure. Azcapotzalco, once unchallenged, found itself surrounded by forces it had underestimated. The Mexica and their allies closed in, cutting off reinforcements, pressing their advantage with measured determination. When the city at last fell, it marked not only the end of Tepanec dominance but the quiet turning of an age. For Tenochtitlan, the victory was profound, not because it was won with overwhelming force, but because it represented a complete transformation of identity. A people who had once lived as servants now stood as equals among the great cities of the valley. Their island, once a cluster of huts rising from marshland, was becoming something different, a center of decision-making, strategy, and emerging power. In the calm that followed the fall of Azcapotzalco, leaders across the basin paused to reconsider alliances and obligations. No longer bound by Tepanec rule, Tenochtitlan and Texcoco moved to shape a new political landscape, not through domination alone, but through cooperation with shared purpose. The years of subordination had taught them both the dangers of placing too much power in a single hand. And so, out of the quiet aftermath of war, a new bond began to form, one that would redefine the structure of the valley and guide the Mexica onto the path of empire. With the Tepanec hegemony broken, the Mexica turned toward new bonds that would reshape the entire basin. In the quiet months following the fall of Azcapotzalco, the Valley of Mexico stood momentarily unanchored. The authority that had shaped its politics for generations had dissolved, leaving space for something new to take form. Cities that once bowed to Tepanec demands now watched and waited, uncertain of what kind of order would rise in the vacuum. Into the stillness came a series of measured conversations, soft-spoken councils, private negotiations, and meetings held beneath woven canopies on Tenochtitlan's growing island. Out of these dialogues emerged a new political vision, an alliance built not on domination by a single power, but on shared strength among three. The foundations of the Triple Alliance were laid by three Altepetl, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, each carrying its own history and its own reasons for embracing cooperation. Tenochtitlan entered the negotiations with the confidence of recent military success, yet with the memory of subordination still close enough to guide its caution. Texcoco, long recognized as a center of wisdom, law, and artistic culture, brought the intellectual prestige that the valley respected. Tlacopan, a smaller but strategically essential city, stood at the western edge of the lake system, linking former Tepanec domains to the emerging coalition. These cities did not come together in a sudden declaration. Instead, the alliance took shape through slow, deliberate agreement. Leaders met on modest reed mats, accompanied by attendants who kept records on folded books of Amati paper. Couriers moved quietly across the lake surface, carrying proposals, concerns, and revisions. Each Altepetl had suffered under the heavy hand of Azcapotzalco, and each had learned that unity could provide protection against the rise of another overwhelming power. At the heart of these discussions lay the question of balance. How could three cities share ambition without allowing one to overshadow the others? The answer emerged through thoughtful negotiation. Tribute from conquered territories would be divided in a precise ratio: 2 parts to Tenochtitlan, 2 parts to Texcoco, and 1 part to Tlacopan. This distribution acknowledged military power and cultural authority while ensuring that each ally benefited materially from expansion. It was a quiet but effective way of maintaining trust. Military obligations were likewise defined with clarity. When campaigns were planned, each city would contribute warriors in proportion to its size and capability. Victories would be celebrated collectively, and defeated cities absorbed into the alliance's growing network of tributaries. The calm structure of these agreements reflected a deep understanding of the valley's past, the dangers of over-centralization, the fragility of imposed control, and the necessity of shared purpose. Texcoco's role in the alliance extended far beyond its tribute share. Under the guidance of Nezahualcóyotl, poet, strategist, and survivor of exile, the city took charge of many legal and administrative matters. Its scholars helped draft the laws that would guide relationships with conquered peoples, ensuring that systems of tribute, land rights, and internal governance remained stable. Texcoco's influence provided the alliance with moral and cultural legitimacy, softening the concerns of independent cities that feared Tenochtitlan might grow too powerful. Tenochtitlan, meanwhile, became the spear of the alliance, the city whose warriors, engineers, and leaders would carry the coalition's ambitions outward into the highlands, valleys, and coastal plains. The Mexica had spent decades sharpening their military discipline under Tepanec command, and now those skills were placed in service of their own expansion. Calmly, without boasting, the narrative of the alliance began to shift. Tenochtitlan was no longer a subordinate island community, but a fully recognized partner in shaping the region's future. Tlacopan's inclusion underscored the alliance's strategic nature. Though smaller in population and influence, its location along the western routes allowed the coalition to secure territories previously aligned with the Tepanecs. Tlacopan also helped maintain continuity for cities that feared abrupt change. Its Tepanec lineage offered reassurance that the new order would not erase everything that had come before. As the months turned into years, councils met regularly to review new tributaries, discuss territorial claims, and evaluate upcoming campaigns. Nothing in these meetings was rushed. Leaders listened to one another, weighed options, and worked to ensure that decisions reflected the coalition rather than the ambitions of a single city. This continuity of process strengthened the alliance's legitimacy. Other Altepetl, observing the stability that emerged from Tenochtitlan and Texcoco's cooperation, began to accept the Triple Alliance as the natural successor to Tepanec rule. It was during this time that the alliance crystallized into a political system with both structure and purpose. Shared ambition, once only an abstract possibility, became a guiding principle. The Allies recognized that the valley's resources were finite, and growth would require expansion beyond the lakes. Calmly and deliberately, they turned their gaze outward, toward the fertile lands of the southern Chinampa districts, the trade routes of the eastern highlands, and the distant cities that controlled rivers, obsidian mines, and coastal markets. Yet even as thoughts of expansion took shape, the alliance remained grounded in its cooperative foundation. Historical memory played a guiding role. These three cities understood that their strength derived from mutual respect. The trauma of Tepanec domination remained fresh enough to remind them of the dangers of internal imbalance. And so the Triple Alliance evolved slowly, its structures reinforced through shared victories, ritualized diplomacy, and continued negotiation. For residents of the valley, the effects of the alliance unfolded gradually. Tribute flows became more predictable, conflicts less frequent. Marketplaces benefited from increased stability, with merchants traveling more freely between cities. Canals and causeways were repaired and extended, improving communication across the waterlogged landscape. And, perhaps most importantly, a new political clarity emerged, an understanding that power now rested not in the hands of one dominant Altepetl but within a carefully constructed partnership. This cooperation did not erase rivalry or ambition. Each city still sought honor through military success, prestige through artistic patronage, and influence through marriage alliances. But the Triple Alliance provided a structure within which these ambitions could coexist, creating a political environment far more stable than the years of Tepanec tension that preceded it. In many ways, the true strength of the Triple Alliance lay not in its armies or wealth, but in the calm foundation upon which it was built. Shared memory, shared purpose, and a shared understanding that the valley's future required a new model of governance. And as the alliance solidified, its eyes turned outward, toward the many independent cities encircling the lakes. How does a rising power learn the rhythm of expansion? Not through glory, but through steady practice. With the Triple Alliance established, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan began to extend their influence across the lakes and valleys that surrounded them. The campaigns that followed were neither dramatic spectacles nor instant conquests. Instead, they unfolded with careful measurement, designed to consolidate authority, secure tribute, and test the cooperation that had been painstakingly cultivated. In this calm period of expansion, the Mexica learned not only how to wage war, but how to sustain a growing political network. Early campaigns focused on nearby city-states that had once been Tepanec tributaries or had remained loosely independent. Armies moved quietly along causeways, through reeds and across shallow channels, arriving at towns that often surrendered after negotiation or demonstration of organized force. Tribute obligations were adjusted methodically, following the distribution formula agreed upon by the three allies. Each campaign was as much about logistics as combat, organizing provisions, coordinating forces from three distinct cities, and ensuring that communication flowed smoothly across waterways and hills. The Mexica approach to warfare emphasized discipline and ceremony. Young warriors were assigned to well-defined units, each with its own responsibilities, heraldry, and methods of training. Observing the movements of these early campaigns, one can see a people shaping their identity through repetition and coordination. Not all victories were measured by territory gained. Many were evaluated by the successful integration of new communities into the tribute system, or by the establishment of local loyalties that reinforced the alliance's credibility. During this time, the Mexica also began to develop flower wars, ritualized confrontations that combined martial skill with ceremonial purpose. These encounters were conducted not solely for the aim of conquest but for practice, reputation, and the capture of tribute in symbolic form. The flower wars allowed young warriors to gain experience, senior warriors to demonstrate leadership, and communities to reinforce bonds through shared participation in a structured, predictable form of conflict. The rhythm of these exercises reflected a careful philosophy. Power grew through preparation and order, not impulsive violence. Every campaign required attention to detail. Canoes and causeways were repaired and reinforced to ensure movement of troops and supplies. Scouts observed terrain and seasonal patterns, noting where reeds impeded progress, where shallow channels could conceal hidden approaches, and where neighboring communities might provide intelligence or resistance. In quiet councils, the leaders of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan reviewed each movement, learning from successes and setbacks alike. Mistakes were not dramatized, but quietly corrected in the next engagement. Through repetition, the alliance strengthened both its discipline and its reputation. The early years of expansion also nurtured administrative growth. As new towns submitted to alliance authority, officials were appointed to oversee tribute collection, local governance, and conflict mediation. These responsibilities often rotated among the three partners, ensuring that no single city dominated emerging territories. Mexica administrators learned to balance firmness with diplomacy, combining respect for local customs with the demands of the growing coalition. Every interaction reinforced the lesson that expansion depended on steady governance as much as on military prowess. Through these measured campaigns, the Mexica and their allies honed a sense of timing and patience. Victory was often a matter of preparation and endurance, not of sudden brilliance. Armies marched slowly, observing the seasons, considering the condition of the chinampas, and coordinating with allied contingents. Each step was deliberate, each decision quietly tested against prior experience. Observers at the time might have perceived the campaigns as ordinary movements, yet they were forging the capabilities that would one day sustain empire. Another subtle discovery emerged in the interactions among allies. Texcoco contributed strategy and oversight. Tlacopan provided geographical advantage and logistical support. Tenochtitlan supplied disciplined warriors and the energy of a people once tested by servitude. Through cooperation, each city learned to trust the others. Disagreements were resolved in councils, and minor setbacks became lessons in negotiation and patience. By moving carefully, the alliance built a foundation stronger than the sum of its parts. Culturally, these campaigns reinforced identity and social cohesion. Warriors returned with stories of distant lakes and towns, of ceremonial exchanges, and of the calm order required to integrate new communities. Religious ceremonies marked the completion of campaigns, honoring deities for guidance and safe return. Markets thrived along causeways, reflecting the peaceful aspects of expansion, trade, tribute, and the circulation of goods. In these subtle rhythms, the Mexica understood that the growth of power was inseparable from the growth of social and spiritual life. The long-term consequence of this period was not simply the accumulation of tribute or territory, but the quiet consolidation of experience and confidence. The Mexica learned to coordinate multiple armies, manage alliances, govern newly incorporated towns, and maintain their own identity within a larger coalition. Each campaign, each negotiation, each carefully organized movement strengthened the city's sense of self and of its potential. Expansion became a methodical process, built on repetition, observation, and patient adaptation. By the end of these early campaigns, Tenochtitlan had become something more than a rising city. It had transformed into a disciplined, confident actor within the valley's political landscape. Its warriors knew the patterns of movement and battle. Its administrators understood the logic of tribute and local authority. Its leaders had earned the respect of allies and former Tepanec subjects alike. This was not the empire of future legend, but the careful groundwork from which that empire would grow. With each campaign, Tenochtitlan grew more confident, and soon, a new ruler would shape that confidence into empire. What qualities allow a leader not merely to rule a city, but to define the meaning of its destiny? When Montezuma Ilwakamana, later remembered as Montezuma the Elder, assumed the throne of Tenochtitlan, he inherited a city that had already transformed from a marginal island settlement into the leading partner of a powerful Triple Alliance. Yet the challenges that awaited him were more subtle than battlefields or tributary disputes. The Mexica had established military competence and political alliances, but their identity, their sacred purpose, and the frameworks of governance required refinement. Montezuma's vision was to weave together these threads into a coherent tapestry, one where leadership, religion, and law moved in quiet, deliberate synchrony. Montezuma's lineage itself spoke to this intertwining of past and purpose. Descended from a line connected to both Toltec traditions and earlier rulers of Tenochtitlan, he embodied continuity as much as ambition. His ascension was not merely a transfer of political power, but a ritual affirmation that the city's destiny was aligned with cosmic order. Scholars and priests recognized in him the ideal balance of warrior, administrator, and spiritual intermediary. Under his guidance, the throne became more than a seat of governance. It became the axis around which the city's identity, its alliances, and its ambitions rotated. From the first days of his rule, Montezuma undertook reforms with patience and foresight. He reinforced the sacred central precinct, expanding temples and ceremonial spaces that linked political authority to spiritual legitimacy. Stone and wood were shaped not only for durability but for alignment with celestial patterns, reflecting the Mexica belief that governance mirrored the cosmos. Each new structure, each carefully placed altar, served as a tangible reminder that rulership was inseparable from sacred duty. Visitors, residents, and diplomats alike would perceive that the city's physical organization echoed its metaphysical order. Equally important was the organization of the priestly hierarchies. Montezuma structured the clergy into clear roles and responsibilities, ensuring that religious life could scale with the city's growing population. Priests oversaw rituals, festivals, and the maintenance of the calendar. They instructed warriors in ceremonial conduct. They mediated the relationships between local communities and the central authorities. Through these calm, methodical reforms, Montezuma aligned spiritual authority with civic administration, creating a system in which ritual and law reinforced one another. Yet Montezuma's leadership extended beyond temples and hierarchies. He framed expansion itself as a cosmic duty, integrating conquest and tribute into a vision of order rather than mere acquisition. The growth of the Mexica state was presented as a reflection of divine favor, a necessary extension of the sacred city into the surrounding world. Each campaign, each new alliance, was framed within the larger context of balance, ensuring that the pursuit of power harmonized with the moral and ritual obligations of kingship. Through this vision, citizens and warriors alike internalized the sense that the state's outward actions were also expressions of spiritual purpose. Administrative reforms accompanied these spiritual innovations. Montezuma clarified systems of tribute collection, ensuring that resources from allied and conquered cities were distributed equitably among Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. He reinforced the Calpulli system within the city, integrating clan responsibilities with central governance, so that local communities maintained a voice while contributing to the broader framework of authority. Roads, canals, and marketplaces were improved, not for spectacle, but for steady administration and the predictable functioning of civic life. In this way, Montezuma combined vision with practicality, recognizing that sacred and material prosperity were inseparable. A calm discovery of this period lies in the merging of ideology and practice. While later centuries might emphasize the grandeur of conquest or the dramatic spectacle of ritual, Montezuma's reign demonstrates a quieter mastery, aligning civic infrastructure, spiritual observance, and administrative efficiency. Each decision, each building, each festival reflected a philosophy in which governance was both visible and invisible, tangible in stone and subtle in the flow of social life. Education and moral instruction also became central to his rule. The young nobility were trained in law, history, and ceremony, learning the principles that would guide their own leadership in years to come. Warriors were instructed in ethics and ritual as much as in strategy and formations. By embedding knowledge of sacred responsibility into the hearts of those who would govern, Montezuma ensured that the city's emerging institutions carried coherence beyond his own lifetime. Through all these reforms, the ruler's presence remained measured and consistent. He did not rely on displays of force alone. His authority was maintained in quiet observation, ritual participation, and the careful alignment of his actions with precedent. By doing so, Montezuma cultivated legitimacy that transcended fear or fleeting charisma, building a foundation of respect and compliance rooted in cultural understanding. In many ways, the calm genius of Montezuma's reign lay in preparation and foresight. Each temple completed, each law codified, each tributary district organized was a step toward a larger vision. A Mexica state capable of enduring growth, cultural cohesion, and spiritual meaning. Expansion, conquest, and diplomacy were all understood as extensions of this foundational order. The city, now physically impressive but still centered on marshland ingenuity and Chinampa agriculture, became a microcosm of cosmic structure. By the end of this phase, Tenochtitlan was no longer simply a partner in the Triple Alliance or a rising military power. It had become a city with a coherent identity, with sacred purpose woven into every aspect of civic life, and with leadership capable of projecting both stability and vision. Citizens, nobles, and priests alike experienced the rhythm of governance and ritual as part of daily life, internalizing the understanding that the Mexica state was both human and divine in its design. Montezuma's spiritual authority soon took material form, shaping new laws that ordered the expanding world around him. How does a growing empire learn to count, measure, and order the world under its care? Under Montezuma I, the Mexica began to transform the abstract authority of kingship into the tangible machinery of empire. The city's sacred and military foundations were now joined by a network of administrative practices designed to keep a rapidly expanding population coordinated and cohesive. The work of governance, once fluid and ad hoc, became increasingly methodical, measured, and quietly precise, reflecting the same deliberate rhythm that had guided Tenochtitlan's rise from swamp to island city. A cornerstone of this system was the tribute network, carefully organized to sustain both the Triple Alliance and the city itself. Tributes were collected from towns and villages, sometimes nearby and sometimes several days' travel away, including goods as diverse as maize, cacao, feathers, textiles, and obsidian. Each item was noted with care, tallied in pictorial codices, and inspected by officials trained in observation, measurement, and record-keeping. These codices, carefully drawn on Amati paper, became both practical tools and enduring historical records, capturing the wealth, diversity, and reach of the Mexica state. Through them, Montezuma's government was able to translate the complexities of human labor, trade, and production into a system that could be understood, audited, and directed. Alongside tribute, the rulers strengthened the administrative roles of inspectors and scribes, who moved through cities, marketplaces, and roadways to ensure compliance with imperial law. They observed merchants, monitored the movement of goods, and noted any discrepancies in tribute delivery. Each inspection was carried out with the calm authority of a state that sought order rather than spectacle, reinforcing standards without unnecessary coercion. For citizens, the presence of these officials became a quiet reassurance that resources would be allocated fairly, that obligations were understood, and that the empire operated under predictable, consistent rules. The codification of laws and social structures further reinforced this order. Montezuma clarified distinctions among social classes, defining the rights and responsibilities of nobles, commoners, and specialized laborers. Market behavior was regulated to ensure fairness, prevent fraud, and maintain social harmony. Conduct in public spaces, ritual plazas, causeways, and communal halls was guided by standards that balanced authority with civic cooperation. Every law was an exercise in quiet management, a subtle means of shaping behavior without abrupt enforcement or intimidation. In these rules, the Mexica found not only stability, but also a framework for collective identity. Everyone, from the humblest fisherman to the high priest, understood their role in the functioning of the city and the broader empire. The daily operations of Tenochtitlan reflected this meticulous approach. Markets bustled with merchants carrying goods from the lakes, highlands, and coastal regions, their movements choreographed to meet both local demand and tribute quotas. Caravans traveled carefully along causeways, carrying maize, textiles, and ritual items to central collection points. Officials recorded these goods, balancing quantities against the codices and reporting any irregularities to the ruler's council. Even in motion, the empire maintained an understated elegance, every movement of people and product contributing to a larger, coherent system. A calm discovery of this period lies in the intersection of bureaucracy and culture. Administrative rigor did not suppress artistic expression. Instead, it provided a stable backdrop against which culture could flourish. Temple festivals, poetic recitations, and musical performances were scheduled and supported by the state, ensuring that civic life and religious observance could grow alongside the machinery of tribute and law. The city, through its codices and inspectors, measured the world, while simultaneously creating space for the intangible: artistry, devotion, and shared identity. Montezuma also refined the role of the nobility within this structure. Clans and calpuli were integrated into governance in ways that balanced hereditary privilege with civic responsibility. Nobles oversaw local tribute collection, adjudicated minor disputes, and acted as intermediaries between the central authority and smaller communities. This integration strengthened loyalty while distributing the practical burdens of administration. Nobles were encouraged to see themselves as custodians of both law and tradition, anchoring the empire's growth in social stability. The practicalities of expansion required additional innovation. Roads were maintained and extended to facilitate the movement of tribute and communication. Canals and causeways ensured that lakeside communities could send goods efficiently. Diplomatic envoys traveled quietly to neighboring cities to negotiate the terms of submission or alliance, observing local customs while extending the authority of the Triple Alliance. Through these systems, the empire's reach became both tangible and orderly, grounded in careful observation rather than arbitrary force. Education and record-keeping were central to sustaining this administrative apparatus. Scribes, trained from youth in the art of codices, learned to translate numbers, pictograms, and seasonal cycles into records that could guide decision-making for years. These calm custodians of information became the living memory of the empire, ensuring that policies were consistent, predictable, and responsive to change. Even minor errors in recording could ripple outward, and so attention to detail became a defining characteristic of imperial governance. Ultimately, the administrative reforms of Montezuma demonstrate a subtle truth. Empire is as much about precision and observation as it is about conquest or ceremony. By establishing predictable systems for tribute, law, and social regulation, the ruler transformed Tenochtitlan from a city with ambition into a governing center capable of sustaining multiple generations of expansion and cultural achievement. Citizens could walk the streets knowing that markets were fair, laws were upheld, and resources were managed thoughtfully. The state operated with quiet authority rather than spectacle. This period also laid the groundwork for future imperial integration. Tributary towns learned to see their obligations not as arbitrary impositions, but as structured relationships embedded in law, ritual, and shared governance. Mexica oversight was firm yet measured, emphasizing predictable order and consistent enforcement. In this way, Montezuma's reforms established the principle that empire was built as much in the ledger and codex as on the battlefield. By the end of his administrative innovations, Tenochtitlan had become a city of coordinated movement, careful record-keeping, and structured ritual, where law, tribute, and daily life were interwoven with sacred duty. Citizens and allies alike recognized that their participation in these systems connected them to the cosmos, to the authority of the ruler, and to the larger story of the Mexica people. Here, governance was quiet, deliberate, and enduring, a soft architecture of human and divine order. These new structures supported not only governance, but the flourishing of culture and expression across the valley. What stories do stone pyramids tell when approached not with fear, but with patient curiosity? In the mid-1400s, as Montezuma I's rule matured, the physical and spiritual heart of Tenochtitlan began to take its enduring form. The city, already remarkable for its network of canals, causeways, and chinampas, now turned inward toward the sacred precincts at its center. Here, stone and ritual intertwined, creating a landscape where architecture, ceremony, and cosmic symbolism merged into a cohesive vision. At the heart of this sacred geography stood the Templo Mayor, the great pyramid that would become the axis of the Mexica universe. Construction of the Templo Mayor was both methodical and symbolic. Layers of stone were added gradually, each level representing cycles of cosmic renewal and the growing authority of the city. The design reflected the Mexica understanding of duality. The two principal shrines atop the pyramid honored Huitzilopochtli, god of the sun and war, and Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility. These deities embodied complementary forces, the energy of conquest and the sustenance of crops, reminding citizens that both human effort and divine favor were essential for life. Unlike dramatic accounts of sacrifice, the calm perspective focuses on the intent and symbolism embedded in the pyramid itself, a monument to order, balance, and interconnection. Priests, carefully trained in ritual knowledge, orchestrated ceremonies that marked the passage of time and the rhythms of life. They consulted Tanalpwali, the 260-day sacred calendar, and the Xiapawali, the 365-day agricultural cycle, ensuring that offerings, festivals, and civic obligations aligned with celestial patterns. Each ritual, whether a daily offering or an annual festival, reinforced the understanding that human participation sustained the cosmos. Observers might imagine the slow cadence of incense smoke rising from the pyramid, the measured steps of priests along its terraces, and the quiet attentiveness of citizens who gathered in the plazas below. In these moments, devotion was as much about reflection and presence as it was about performance. The Templo Mayor's construction was not only symbolic but practical in its integration of space and community. Surrounding courts, altars, and stairways facilitated gatherings and processions, allowing citizens to participate in rituals and observe cosmic order enacted in real time. The layout of plazas, causeways, and canals emphasized accessibility while maintaining sacred boundaries, creating a landscape where spiritual, civic, and social life could coexist. Even the placement of sacrificial stones and offerings was guided by careful consideration, reflecting a worldview in which human activity resonated with cosmic cycles rather than merely asserting dominance. Architecture, ritual, and timekeeping were intimately linked. Priests recorded ceremonial observations on codices, noting celestial alignments, agricultural cycles, and the rhythm of festivals. These records allowed them to predict seasonal changes, coordinate civic work, and maintain harmony between human activity and the divine order. Each ceremony was a lesson in patience, repetition, and the subtle interplay between the temporal and eternal. For citizens, participation in rituals, from offering maize at a household shrine to witnessing seasonal festivals at the Templo Mayor, reinforced a sense of belonging within a larger, structured universe. A calm discovery of this era lies in the integration of spirituality and civic life. Festivals were not mere spectacle. They were occasions for reflection, instruction, and community cohesion. Music, dance, and poetry accompanied ceremonies, aligning emotion and intellect with the movement of the cosmos. Markets adjacent to the sacred precincts thrived during festivals, connecting economic life with ritual observance. Artisans, scribes, and merchants all played subtle roles in sustaining the rhythm of daily and sacred life. In this way, the city's material and spiritual growth advanced hand in hand. Montezuma's guidance ensured that ritual authority was carefully structured and distributed. Senior priests oversaw training, coordinated ceremonies, and interpreted omens. Lower-ranking clergy facilitated local observances and assisted in maintaining the temple precincts. This hierarchical system created continuity, allowing the Templo Mayor and other shrines to function smoothly even as the city expanded. Each role, from high priest to apprentice, contributed to the maintenance of cosmic and civic balance, demonstrating the subtle interplay between spiritual leadership and administrative order. The Templo Mayor also served as a canvas for symbolism, representing the Mexica understanding of the city as the center of the universe. From its summit, priests could observe the surrounding lakes, causeways, and mountains, noting the interplay of natural features with human activity. This perspective reinforced the idea that the city itself was both physical and cosmic, a place where water, earth, and sky converged under human care and divine oversight. Citizens moving through plazas, temples, and markets participated in a landscape designed to reflect the sacred logic of their world, teaching in stone what could not always be expressed in words. Even modest offerings and rituals carried layered meaning. Small altars and households mirrored the large-scale ceremonies of the central precinct, embedding cosmic order into everyday life. Farmers placed corn husks or water in home shrines, children learned the songs and stories of the gods, and the daily movements of markets and canals reflected the harmony between human effort and divine oversight. The quiet, pervasive nature of ritual ensured that spirituality remained woven into every aspect of social life, guiding citizens not through fear, but through observation, participation, and subtle instruction. Through these careful practices, Tenochtitlan became a city where architecture, ritual, and civic identity were inseparable. The Templo Mayor was both a destination and a model, showing citizens the meaning of their shared responsibilities and the rhythms of the cosmos. Montezuma's vision emphasized order, reflection, and continuity, creating a sacred landscape that endured through cycles of construction, ritual, and renewal. Here, the city's growth was inseparable from its understanding of time, space, and the human role in sustaining universal balance. This period also reinforced the connection between sacred authority and cultural expression. Poetry, sculpture, and painted codices reflected the rhythm of rituals and the centrality of cosmic cycles. Artists and scribes documented ceremonies, astronomical observations, and civic events, creating a record of human and divine interaction. These works were not merely decorative. They were integral to the education of citizens, the training of priests, and the perpetuation of institutional memory. In this way, culture and spirituality were inseparable, each informing the other, each advancing the city's understanding of itself and its place in the universe. By the mid-1400s, Tenochtitlan's sacred precincts and ritual systems had become the anchors of civic identity, shaping not only worship but the rhythm of trade, governance, and daily life. Citizens, priests, and rulers moved in patterns that reflected cycles of the cosmos, teaching respect, patience, and the integration of human activity with natural and divine order. The city had become, in essence, a living reflection of Mexica philosophy, a place where architecture, ceremony, and administration converged to sustain life, society, and memory. And as the sacred heart of the city grew, so too did the world of trade, art, and daily life that surrounded it. What did ordinary life feel like in a city of canals, gardens, and floating fields? Tenochtitlan, perched upon the waters of Lake Texcoco, moved with a rhythm both deliberate and gentle. The city's canals reflected the soft morning light as canoes slid quietly between chinampa fields, carrying maize, squash, and beans toward market squares. Smoke curled upward from small hearths in tightly clustered homes, blending with the scent of wet earth and cultivated flowers. Here, the ordinary was quietly extraordinary, a community living in harmony with water, soil, and the structures of social life. The markets formed the pulsating heart of the city. Stalls of woven mats displayed obsidian blades, richly dyed textiles, and vessels of finely worked clay. Women sold cacao beans, flowers, and dried herbs, calling to neighbors in calm, rhythmic tones. Barter was an artful dance. Coins of cacao, bundles of cloth, and quantities of maize measured value, while negotiation involved both observation and memory. Merchants traveled along canals and causeways, moving slowly yet steadily, ensuring that goods reached every Kalpuli neighborhood. These exchanges sustained the city's complex economy and reinforced the social bonds that connected citizens across water and land. Beyond the markets, Chinampa gardens shimmered with life. Narrow raised fields of soil, encircled by shallow channels, were carefully tended by families and laborers. Water from the canals nourished crops in this ingenious system, producing multiple harvests each year. The Chinampas were not only agricultural hubs but communal spaces, teaching cooperation, patience, and respect for the cycles of growth. Morning light glimmered on the narrow waterways, and the reflection of corn stalks in still water created a scene both serene and productive, a living symbol of the city's harmony with nature. The organization of neighborhoods, or Kalpuli, further shaped daily life. Each Kalpuli specialized in particular crafts or production. Some focused on weaving, others on pottery, still others on the cultivation of Chinampas. Women played central roles in household production, grinding maize on metates, preparing food, weaving textiles, and participating in local markets. Men tended fields, built and maintained canals, or engaged in specialized crafts. This division of labor allowed the city to thrive, with families contributing to both local needs and the broader economy of the island. Daily routines reflected careful attention to cleanliness and order. Streets were maintained. Canals were cleared of debris. Homes were swept and adorned with mats and simple furnishings. The hum of activity, fishing, farming, trading, or cooking, never descended into chaos. Instead, it created a rhythm of life that was predictable, comforting, and deeply intertwined with the natural and social environment. Citizens moved through these routines with awareness, their actions contributing to the ongoing stability and well-being of the city. Goods moved through Tenochtitlan with subtle orchestration. Obsidian blades, prized for their sharpness and utility, passed from specialized workshops to markets, to households preparing for construction or ceremony. Woven cloaks, dyed in vibrant hues, signaled social identity and skill. Cacao beans, symbols of both sustenance and currency, flowed along canals and causeways, exchanged quietly among merchants, nobles, and commoners alike. The flow of goods was steady and observed with care, ensuring that production, trade, and consumption aligned with the city's social and spiritual rhythms. A calm discovery of this period lies in the interweaving of work, community, and ritual. Market activity was more than commerce. It was a space for social interaction, education, and transmission of cultural knowledge. The careful arrangement of Chinampas and streets taught principles of cooperation, patience, and respect for the environment. Even mundane tasks, grinding maize, weaving baskets, or ferrying goods, were embedded with significance, connecting daily labor to a broader pattern of civic and cosmic order. Education unfolded naturally within these routines. Children learned observation, measurement, and practical skills from parents and neighbors. Nobles received instruction in law, history, and ritual from priests and elders, while commoners learned the rhythms of trade, cultivation, and craft. Schools, both formal and informal, taught not only skills but also the principles of responsibility, social cohesion, and participation in civic life. Learning was integrated into daily activity, a gentle process of observation, imitation, and reflection rather than rigid instruction. The architecture of the island city reflected the balance of utility and calm aesthetics. Homes were constructed from reeds, wood, and plaster, raised above water levels to accommodate seasonal fluctuations. Causeways connected neighborhoods, lined with trees and occasional shrines. Bridges and canals were maintained to facilitate the smooth passage of goods and people. These structures, modest yet functional, allowed the city to operate as a coherent organism, a place where life, work, and ritual flowed seamlessly together. Citizens experienced a sense of connection to both community and environment. The proximity of gardens and waterways fostered awareness of seasonal cycles. Markets connected families to distant regions. Rituals embedded in daily life reminded individuals of their responsibilities and place within the broader cosmology. In this integration of labor, observation, and reflection, the Mexica cultivated a life that was ordered, productive, and resonant with meaning. By observing the city from above, one could see a living network of canals, gardens, streets, and plazas, all moving with quiet purpose. The city's vitality lay not in grandeur or spectacle, but in the steady, patient rhythm of its daily life. Merchants trading, children learning, families working, and priests preparing for ceremonies. In these ordinary moments, Tenochtitlan revealed the subtle genius of its design, blending utility, beauty, and spiritual awareness. As the sun rose and fell, as canals mirrored clouds and chinampas flourished with crops, Tenochtitlan's citizens lived in patterns of calm productivity and attentive care. Each day reinforced the social, economic, and spiritual structures that sustained the city, providing a foundation for the larger achievements of empire. This rhythm of life, both gentle and precise, became a model for order, cooperation, and continuity in the Mexico world. And within these peaceful routines, education shaped the minds of the next generation. How did a people known for warfare also cultivate some of the most delicate poetry of their age? In Tenochtitlan, learning unfolded with patience, rhythm, and structure. Education was not confined to rote memorization. It was a practice of shaping minds, cultivating virtue, and embedding individuals within the larger web of social, civic, and cosmic life. Two primary schools guided this formation: the Calmecac and the Telpacali. The Calmecac served the nobility, where children were instructed in history, ritual, astronomy, law, and the responsibilities of leadership. Here, students observed ceremonies, copied codices, and absorbed the subtleties of sacred protocol, learning to navigate both the spiritual and administrative duties they would one day inherit. In parallel, the Telpacali nurtured commoner youth, emphasizing practical skills, community responsibility, and martial discipline. Students learned the techniques of agriculture, craft, and basic governance, while also participating in ritual training that reinforced civic values. Both institutions shared a quiet purpose: to cultivate informed, capable citizens who understood the balance between personal ambition, social duty, and the rhythms of the cosmos. Education was, in essence, a living dialogue with the past, present, and future of the Mexica people. Amid this structured learning, the arts flourished in subtle, reflective ways. Painting, sculpture, and codex illustration recorded the city's rituals, history, and daily life with careful attention to form and meaning. Each image was not simply decorative but a meditation on identity, memory, and the patterns of nature and society. Scholars, scribes, and artisans worked together, producing visual narratives that could be read and interpreted across generations, teaching both practical knowledge and philosophical reflection. Music and dance complemented these visual arts, flowing through temples, markets, and neighborhood spaces. Drums, flutes, and the soft resonance of string instruments marked the pace of ceremonies and festivals, guiding both participants and observers into shared awareness. Movements were deliberate, echoing the celestial cycles and reinforcing the idea that human action mirrored cosmic patterns. In this way, artistry was inseparable from education, ritual, and daily life. Among the most celebrated voices of the era were the poets, who gave language a reflective, contemplative power. Figures such as Nezahualcóyotl, the poet king of Texcoco, influenced the Mexica imagination with verses that pondered the transience of life, the pursuit of virtue, and the mysteries of existence. Poetry, often accompanied by music, was a medium through which citizens explored human emotion, ethical reflection, and the relationship between mortality and the divine. Words, carefully chosen and rhythmically arranged, became instruments of understanding, shaping both thought and feeling. The calm beauty of Mexica poetry lay in its integration with everyday experience. Verses reflected the cycles of planting and harvest, the movement of the sun and moon, and the social duties of family, neighbor, and ruler. A poem was as much a lesson as it was an aesthetic creation, a mirror of the cosmos, a meditation on human life, and a record of shared memory. Through these expressions, citizens learned to perceive the subtleties of language, the depth of metaphor, and the connections between observation, reflection, and action. Painted codices further amplified this quiet exploration. Illustrations captured ceremonies, genealogies, and natural phenomena with both precision and artistry. Each page invited attentive viewing, encouraging the reader to notice patterns, relationships, and symbolic meaning. In this manner, codices became both educational tools and aesthetic experiences, fostering a deep sense of cultural continuity and awareness. A calm discovery of this period lies in the synergy of intellectual, artistic, and spiritual life. The Mexica did not separate martial prowess from aesthetic refinement. Rather, they recognized that wisdom, beauty, and ethical reflection were essential to sustaining both civic order and cosmic balance. A young warrior might memorize codices while learning tactical formations, understanding that discipline and reflection were inseparable. A noble student in the Calmecac might study astronomy alongside poetry, seeing the heavens not only as mechanical phenomena but as guides to ethical and civic behavior. Citizens, young and old, participated in these cycles of education and artistry without haste or spectacle. Festivals, classroom instruction, and neighborhood observances provided continuity and repetition, creating a stable environment in which knowledge, memory, and cultural identity could flourish. The city itself, with its canals, marketplaces, and temples, served as both classroom and canvas, teaching through structure, rhythm, and visual experience. Music, poetry, and codices also facilitated communication across the empire. Envoys and visiting dignitaries could interpret verses and images, recognizing shared values, ritual practices, and political relationships. This subtle transmission of culture reinforced cohesion, while providing a reflective counterbalance to the more visible aspects of military and administrative life. In Tenochtitlan, learning and art were not isolated. They were part of a broader philosophy in which civic, spiritual, and aesthetic concerns were intertwined. By cultivating intellectual and artistic practice alongside governance and labor, Montezuma I and his contemporaries ensured that the Mexica state was more than a machine of tribute and power. It became a living, reflective society, in which observation, memory, and expression were as valued as conquest or production. Poetry, music, codices, and ritual offered citizens a means to understand themselves, their community, and their place within the larger cosmos. The city's cultural life also fostered patience, empathy, and introspection, qualities that would resonate with citizens as they navigated the complexities of empire. In quiet classrooms, bustling marketplaces, and temple precincts, the Mexica cultivated both skill and reflection, creating a society where learning and beauty were embedded in daily life. The ordinary and the extraordinary coexisted seamlessly. A family preparing maize, a scribe copying a codex, a poet reciting verses, all contributing to the fabric of civic and cosmic understanding. Yet beyond art and learning, long-distance trade connected the Mexica to a wider world of landscapes and peoples. What stories did the merchants carry home after months along distant roads? In the bustling heart of Tenochtitlan, another rhythm of life quietly unfolded, carried by those who traversed distant lands. The Poctica, long-distance merchants, moved with careful deliberation across mountains, lakes, and plains, connecting the Mexica to a wider, diverse world. Their journeys were measured and purposeful, often spanning weeks or months, and demanded a combination of skill, observation, and patience. These travelers were not simply traders. They were bearers of culture, diplomacy, and knowledge, moving quietly between regions with an awareness of both opportunity and risk. The Paktika often organized themselves into secret societies, groups bound by shared knowledge, mutual responsibility, and ritual practice. Membership involved training in navigation, negotiation, and discreet intelligence gathering. They observed foreign customs, recorded economic data, and carried messages or tribute back to Tenochtitlan, acting as both commercial intermediaries and subtle diplomatic envoys. Their work extended the city's influence far beyond the lakes, quietly shaping alliances, monitoring distant rivals, and ensuring that the Triple Alliance remained informed of conditions across Mesoamerica. Goods flowed along these trade networks with a quiet significance. Jade, quetzal feathers, cacao, obsidian, shells, and exotic textiles were carefully packed and transported in canoes, over causeways, or along highland trails. Upon their return, merchants brought items that would be used in ritual, adornment, or ceremony, subtly linking distant lands to the spiritual and civic life of Tenochtitlan. A jade figurine might find its place on a temple altar. Quetzal feathers could decorate the cloak of a noble. Cacao beans might be shared in a market or presented as tribute. Every item carried not only material value but also the narrative of its origin, a story of people, landscapes, and traditions far beyond the city's waters. These journeys offered the Mexica a window into regional diversity. Merchants observed different farming practices, architectural styles, social hierarchies, and spiritual observances, learning the rhythms and priorities of neighboring peoples. This knowledge informed decisions in Tenochtitlan, which alliances to pursue, how to manage tribute, and how to navigate diplomacy with distant rulers. The Paktika were, in essence, cultural conduits, bringing the breadth of Mesoamerican life into the city's consciousness without spectacle or urgency. A calm discovery of this era lies in the integration of commerce, diplomacy, and cultural transmission. Trade was not merely an economic activity. It was a means of understanding the wider world, fostering mutual awareness, and maintaining social and political cohesion. Merchants, through careful observation and patient negotiation, ensured that the Mexica were aware of both opportunities and potential threats, even as they enriched the city with goods and ideas from distant regions. The Paktika also carried ritual significance. Certain merchants were responsible for transporting sacred items or offerings to distant cities, maintaining ceremonial connections across space. These journeys required precision, timing, and observance of ritual proprieties, reflecting the understanding that commerce, spirituality, and social order were intertwined. Every step along a mountain pass or through a tropical forest was measured, deliberate, and guided by both practical and cosmological awareness. In Tenochtitlan's markets, the fruits of these journeys became part of daily and ceremonial life. Exotic feathers adorned ceremonial headdresses, shells were exchanged in ritual contexts, and rare stones were placed carefully in temples and shrines. Citizens could observe these items and imagine the long, patient journey of the merchants who had brought them, fostering a sense of connection to lands and peoples far beyond the lakes. Through these objects, the Mexica experienced the vastness and diversity of Mesoamerica in small, tangible ways, allowing the city's inhabitants to engage with the wider world without leaving their own canals and causeways. The Paktika were also custodians of knowledge and subtle intelligence. By traveling far and observing local politics, economies, and resources, they provided Tenochtitlan with insights that would guide strategic decisions. These reports were relayed quietly to councils, informing both the ruler and the administrative elite. Knowledge of distant rivals or potential allies allowed the city to act with foresight, reinforcing the careful planning and deliberate rhythm that characterized Mexica governance. The movement of goods and ideas along these trade routes emphasized interconnectedness. Even in the quietest moments, Tenochtitlan's citizens felt the presence of distant regions through objects, stories, and subtle influence. The city became a nexus not merely of politics or tribute, but of shared culture, innovation, and observation. By integrating these external elements into daily life, the Mexica demonstrated that empire was not only maintained through conquest or administration, but also through awareness, patience, and quiet engagement with the wider world. By the mid-15th century, these networks of commerce and observation had woven a broader cultural horizon into Tenochtitlan's identity. Citizens were accustomed to goods and ideas from distant regions, absorbing these influences into ritual, art, and daily practice. The calm, deliberate journeys of the Paktika ensured that the city was never insular, but continuously informed, connected, and responsive. Each returned merchant brought not only material wealth but also stories, perspectives, and experiences that shaped the intellectual and social life of the city. Through these long-distance networks, the Mexica cultivated both curiosity and understanding. The empire's reach extended quietly into valleys, mountains, and coastal plains, not only through tribute but through observation, exchange, and reflection. The lessons carried home by merchants on governance, ritual, environment, and human behavior became part of the fabric of Tenochtitlan, reinforcing its capacity to adapt, absorb, and thrive. And along these trade routes came not only goods, but the knowledge of lands the empire would soon encounter more directly. How does an empire decide where its edges should lie? By the late 15th century, Tenochtitlan had matured from an ambitious island city into the central power of the Valley of Mexico. Under the reign of a Huitzilopochtli, the empire's vision extended beyond the familiar lakes and causeways, reaching into distant valleys, highlands, and coastal plains. Unlike the dramatic tales of sudden conquest, the expansion of the Mexica under a Huitzilopochtli was deliberate and strategic, shaped by considerations of geography, resources, trade, and political stability. Maps of the period, preserved in later codices, reveal a network of tributary towns, fortifications, and roads, tracing the careful reach of imperial influence into Oaxaca, the Gulf Coast, and the Western Highlands. A Huitzilopochtli inherited an empire already familiar with both cooperation and conflict. The Triple Alliance had established systems of tribute, military obligation, and ritualized diplomacy that provided structure for further expansion. These frameworks allowed a Huitzilopochtli to pursue new territories without destabilizing existing governance. Rather than an unbridled quest for land, the emperor prioritized regions that could supply essential goods, cacao from tropical lowlands, jaguar skins from forests, and minerals from highland mines, while also reinforcing the prestige of Tenochtitlan's military and ceremonial hierarchy. Each campaign was a quiet calculation, integrating observation, negotiation, and the measured application of force. The military organization of the Mexica was central to this methodical expansion. Warrior societies, trained since youth in the Telpacali, were organized by rank, achievement, and role within both offensive and defensive operations. Campaigns were planned with attention to seasonal conditions, terrain, and supply routes. Rather than emphasizing the chaos of battle, a calm narrative highlights the careful coordination. The movement of troops along causeways, the positioning of scouts to observe enemy positions, and the construction of temporary camps to sustain soldiers over long distances. These efforts reveal an empire attentive to logistics, timing, and long-term sustainability. Huitzilopochtli's campaigns in Oaxaca illustrate this approach. The Zapotec cities in the Valley of Oaxaca were long-established cultural centers, rich in architecture, craft, and agricultural productivity. Mexica armies moved deliberately, negotiating where possible and asserting dominance where necessary. Tribute agreements were formalized, often integrating local elites into the imperial system. In doing so, Tenochtitlan expanded not only territorially but administratively, weaving distant cities into the broader network of governance. The calm observation of these processes emphasizes adaptation, mutual recognition, and integration rather than mere conquest. Along the Gulf Coast, the Mexica extended influence into fertile lowlands. These regions supplied cacao, cotton, and tropical fruits, commodities of both economic and ritual importance. Merchant networks, Paktika, accompanied military expeditions, ensuring that trade remained active and tribute flows were maintained. A Huitzilopochtli strategy balanced the imposition of authority with the practicalities of distance, environmental challenges, and seasonal variation. Observation of terrain, climate, and river systems allowed the empire to integrate these far-flung regions without destabilizing the core. In the Western Highlands, campaigns moved through rugged valleys and elevated plateaus, where local polities had long exercised autonomy. The Mexica established garrisons and reinforced alliances, constructing roads and causeways to facilitate movement of troops, tribute, and communication. These infrastructural projects, often overlooked in grand narratives of conquest, were critical to the sustainability of empire. A Huitzilopochtli commissioned aqueducts and waterworks that connected distant neighborhoods to Tenochtitlan, improving both sanitation and agricultural irrigation. By integrating engineering with expansion, the emperor ensured that physical and social systems advanced in tandem. A calm discovery of a Huitzilopochtli's reign lies in the interplay of prestige and practicality. Military campaigns were as much about ceremony and perception as about territorial gain. Victories were commemorated with rituals that reinforced social cohesion, honored deities, and instructed citizens about the values of discipline, courage, and civic duty. These rituals, interwoven with logistical planning and administrative oversight, created a steady rhythm of expansion in which symbolic, material, and political dimensions were inseparable. A Huitzilopochtli also strengthened the central authority of Tenochtitlan while respecting local governance structures in conquered regions. Local rulers were often retained under Mexica oversight, responsible for collecting tribute and maintaining order. This dual approach, assertion of imperial power alongside pragmatic accommodation, reduced the potential for rebellion and created networks of cooperation. Through careful integration, the empire expanded its edges without fracturing its internal cohesion, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of human, geographic, and material dynamics. Trade and communication remained central to this expansion. Merchants traveled alongside military units, carrying news, coordinating tribute delivery, and facilitating exchanges that linked newly incorporated regions to Tenochtitlan's markets and ritual calendar. Goods moved not only for consumption but as tokens of political allegiance and spiritual significance. Jade, feathers, cacao, and textiles reinforced the authority of the empire while reminding citizens and subjects alike of the reach and order of Mexica society. These flows of goods quietly tied distant communities to the rhythms of the central city. A Huitzilopochtli's reign also emphasized knowledge of terrain and environmental adaptation. The Mexica observed seasonal rains, river behavior, and agricultural cycles to plan campaigns and settlements. By doing so, the empire minimized risk and maximized productivity, integrating new lands into both economic and ritual life. Cities in distant valleys were not simply conquered. They were studied, understood, and incorporated with care. The expansion became a dialogue between people, landscape, and imperial design, rather than an arbitrary assertion of power. By the end of his reign, a Huitzilopochtli had brought Tenochtitlan to its apogee of territorial reach. The empire extended across mountains, lakes, forests, and lowlands, forming a network of tributary regions that supported both civic life and ritual practice. Military prestige, administrative infrastructure, and ceremonial continuity worked together to create stability, allowing the city to flourish culturally, economically, and spiritually. The calm lens focuses on deliberate strategy and measured integration, emphasizing that expansion was guided as much by observation and reflection as by force. But every expansion brings new pressure upon the ruling class. How did a city on a lake manage lands stretching from coasts to mountains? As Tenochtitlan extended its reach under a Huitzilopochtli, the Mexica faced a challenge that was as delicate as it was vast, integrating distant regions into a coherent imperial system. The conquest of Oaxaca, the Gulf Coast, and Western Highlands brought not only tribute and resources but also a rich tapestry of languages, customs, and ecological conditions. Managing this diversity required subtlety, patience, and a thoughtful approach that balanced central authority with local autonomy. The empire's strength lay not solely in military might, but in its capacity to organize, observe, and incorporate. At the heart of this integration was the tribute system, a network designed to gather resources while maintaining the relative independence of subject communities. Each altipetal or city-state submitted specified quantities of food, raw materials, textiles, and luxury goods. These contributions were catalogued carefully by scribes and overseen by administrators, ensuring that the flow of goods sustained both the capital and ceremonial obligations. Tribute was not simply extraction. It was a mechanism of connection. It tied distant valleys and coasts to Tenochtitlan's calendars, markets, and ritual cycles, creating a rhythm of obligation and reciprocity that linked people and place. Yet tribute alone could not maintain cohesion. Local rulers often retained a measure of authority, serving as intermediaries between the central government and their own populations. By allowing existing elites to govern their communities under Mexica's supervision, the empire fostered cooperation, minimized resistance, and respected established social hierarchies. These arrangements were not uniform. Each region's climate, economy, and culture shaped how tribute was collected, how labor was organized, and how civic responsibilities were balanced. A mountain valley producing obsidian might require different oversight than a tropical lowland supplying cacao and feathers, yet both were incorporated within a broader framework that emphasized stability and integration. Language and culture added additional layers of complexity. Across Mesoamerica, numerous tongues and dialects coexisted, and Mexico administrators relied on translators and intermediaries to communicate effectively. Beyond language, customs varied. Forms of governance, ritual practice, agricultural technique, and urban planning were region-specific. Tenochtitlan approached these differences with measured observation. The empire absorbed diversity rather than suppressing it, encouraging each region to maintain recognizable elements of identity while participating in imperial obligations. In this way, the empire functioned as a mosaic, distinct tiles arranged to form a coherent image, each retaining its color and texture. The Paktika, the long-distance merchants, were vital to this integration. They moved along established trade routes, carrying both goods and knowledge. Through their journeys, the central authorities learned about distant political shifts, environmental conditions, and economic opportunities. Merchants acted as eyes and ears, enabling administrators in Tenochtitlan to adjust tribute demands, anticipate shortages, and navigate potential disputes. In effect, commerce became a conduit for governance, connecting the city to the farthest reaches of the empire in ways that were subtle, continuous, and deeply interwoven with everyday life. One calm discovery in this process was the empire's ecological adaptability. The Mexica learned to accommodate the diversity of landscapes under their control. In coastal regions, administrators observed tidal patterns and seasonal storms. In highlands, they monitored rainfall, soil fertility, and crop rotation. Local communities often guided imperial planning, offering insights into irrigation, terrace construction, or forest management. This reciprocal relationship allowed Tenochtitlan to harness local expertise, ensuring that tribute and labor systems worked harmoniously with the environment rather than against it. The administrative framework extended beyond tribute into legal and social integration. Codices recorded obligations, disputes, and agreements. Officials enforced standards of behavior, market fairness, and civic responsibility. Communities learned to navigate imperial expectations while preserving customary practices, and a dialogue emerged between central authority and local tradition. This dialogue was not immediate or uniform. It evolved through observation, correction, and adaptation, reinforcing the Mexica principle that governance required both structure and attentiveness. Religion played a complementary role in binding the empire together. Regional deities were often incorporated into the Mexica cosmology, creating shared ritual calendars and ceremonial obligations. Temples in Tenochtitlan and subject cities reflected the principle that spiritual life connected all parts of the empire. Festivals, offerings, and pilgrimages provided moments of convergence, reinforcing shared values and cosmological understanding, even across great distances. Through these subtle, recurring patterns, citizens and subjects alike were reminded of their place within the larger order. Trade and tribute also facilitated cultural exchange. Exotic goods, jade, quetzal feathers, obsidian, cacao, and colorful textiles moved quietly across the empire, reaching markets and ceremonial spaces in the capital. Alongside material exchange came ideas. Artistic styles, architectural techniques, and ritual forms traveled with merchants and envoys, enriching both local and central cultures. This interplay of goods, knowledge, and artistry created a sense of continuity across regions, blending diversity into a shared imperial experience without erasing individuality. A calm discovery of the height of empire is the delicate balance between centralization and autonomy. Tenochtitlan exerted authority through law, tribute, and ritual, yet it allowed space for local expression, expertise, and governance. The empire was neither monolithic nor chaotic. It was an intricate system of interdependence. Each region contributed to the whole, while the whole protected, observed, and connected each region. Through patience, measurement, and attention to subtle cues, political, economic, environmental, the Mexica sustained a complex empire stretching from mountains to coasts. This balance was reinforced by careful observation of human relationships and expectations. Administrators noted the readiness of local communities to comply, adapt, or resist. Tribute lists were adjusted, alliances honored or renegotiated, and local knowledge was incorporated into decisions about resource allocation, settlement, and infrastructure. Through these practices, the empire remained resilient, its governance informed by both data and human understanding. The calm accumulation of knowledge, observation, and negotiation allowed Tenochtitlan to manage a vast and diverse domain with deliberate care. By integrating tribute, local authority, and cultural exchange, the Mexica created an empire that was both vast and cohesive. It was an empire in which mountains, rivers, forests, and plains were observed, respected, and incorporated, where languages and rituals flourished alongside central authority, and where the rhythms of daily life in distant valleys remained connected to the pulse of the island city. In this integration, the Mexica demonstrated that empire was not only a matter of conquest or tribute, but also of understanding, accommodation, and continuous attention. Yet, even at the height of its power, subtle tensions were beginning to form. What weight rests on a ruler who inherits a world already stretched to its limits? When Montezuma II ascended to the throne in 1502, he inherited an empire that had reached its territorial and administrative zenith. The lakes of the Valley of Mexico shimmered with the reflected power of Tenochtitlan, while distant valleys and coasts contributed tribute that sustained both civic life and ceremonial grandeur. Yet with this expansion came complexity. Networks of allegiance, obligations, and regional autonomy that required constant observation, careful negotiation, and subtle enforcement. Montezuma II, known for his introspective temperament, approached these challenges with a blend of caution and meticulous oversight, quietly adjusting the machinery of empire while maintaining its visible splendor. The emperor's court became more formalized and stratified, reflecting a deliberate assertion of authority and ritual order. Nobles adhered to strict hierarchies, ceremonial behavior was codified, and audiences with the ruler followed precise protocols. This attention to formality was not merely for show. It reinforced the sacred nature of kingship, the continuity of Mexica tradition, and the perception of the ruler as the pivot around which the empire turned. Montezuma II's introspection manifested in careful attention to these ceremonial details, as he understood that the projection of order could stabilize the diverse and far-flung domains under his care. Administration under Montezuma II expanded in scope and precision. Officials recorded tribute with increasing exactitude, codices grew more detailed, and the auditing of goods and labor became a routine, almost meditative exercise. The emperor sought to balance efficiency with oversight, ensuring that each region contributed appropriately without pushing communities toward resentment. Inspectors traveled the empire, quietly observing the collection of tribute, the condition of roads and aqueducts, and the health of markets. In this way, governance was a careful orchestration, a combination of record-keeping, observation, and subtle persuasion, all aimed at sustaining cohesion across a vast and varied landscape. Montezuma II also emphasized ritual and sacred responsibility as pillars of authority. Public ceremonies, festivals, and offerings were conducted with renewed solemnity, reflecting the belief that spiritual observance reinforced social and political stability. Priests coordinated with administrators to ensure that offerings, dances, and sacrifices followed prescribed schedules, while temples remained centers not only of worship but of civic identity. The emperor's personal involvement in these ceremonies conveyed both devotion and accountability. He was a ruler attentive to cosmic balance as much as to human affairs. A calm discovery of this period lies in the psychological dimension of rulership. Montezuma II's reflective personality shaped the empire as much as military or administrative structures did. He observed, recorded, and considered consequences, striving to anticipate challenges before they emerged. In many ways, the emperor's attention to detail mirrored the rhythms of the city itself, disciplined, orderly, and quietly observant. Even the smallest decision, whether regarding tribute, ceremony, or diplomacy, was imbued with an awareness of its wider effect across the lakes, valleys, and mountains. Within the court, tension coexisted with stability. Nobles and officials understood that the emperor's authority was absolute, yet they also recognized the demands placed upon him. Montezuma II's centralization of decision-making required patience, careful deliberation, and loyalty. Advisors were consulted, codices meticulously reviewed, and reports scrutinized. In this way, administration became both a tool of governance and a reflection of the ruler's temperament, a measured response to an empire at the limits of its organizational capacity. The emperor also navigated regional dynamics with subtle diplomacy. While tribute and oversight asserted central authority, Montezuma II recognized the importance of local cooperation. Rulers of subject city-states retained responsibilities for maintaining order, collecting goods, and observing ceremonial obligations. These arrangements allowed the empire to function across diverse environments, economies, and cultures without excessive coercion. The subtle balance of integration and oversight was a testament to both administrative skill and psychological insight, a recognition that empire thrives not solely through imposition, but through careful, continuous attention to human behavior. Montezuma II's reign, however, was also marked by a sense of fragility beneath the splendor. The empire's reach was vast, its systems complex, and its citizenry increasingly aware of the rituals and obligations that governed daily life. While the city's streets, markets, and temples radiated order, the networks of tribute, allegiance, and communication were delicate. Each distant valley or coastal town represented both opportunity and responsibility, requiring observation and occasional adjustment. The emperor's attentiveness to detail, ceremonial formality, and administrative oversight were responses to this inherent fragility, a recognition that the grandeur of Tenochtitlan rested upon a lattice of human and environmental relationships. A gentle discovery of Montezuma II's era is the way ritual and governance intertwined. Ceremonies were not only expressions of faith but also instruments of stability. They communicated hierarchy, reinforced allegiance, and reminded citizens of their interconnectedness within the broader order. Observing the rhythm of festival, tribute, and urban life, the emperor could sense the balance of the empire as a living system, in which human action, spiritual observance, and administrative rigor were inseparable. Through calm reflection, one sees the weight of expectation upon Montezuma II. To rule an empire stretched across mountains, coasts, and lakes required constant attention, foresight, and adaptability. Every tribute caravan, ceremonial procession, and codex entry carried significance. Each decision reverberated quietly through distant communities, shaping perceptions, obligations, and loyalty. The emperor's introspective nature allowed him to engage with these pressures thoughtfully, emphasizing observation and calculation over impulsive action. The ruler's attention extended to the daily life of the capital as well. Markets, Gardens, schools, and workshops continued to function under his oversight. Administrative networks ensured that goods and services moved efficiently, that rituals proceeded on schedule, and that information about distant regions reached the court without delay. Through these mechanisms, the empire's center reflected the discipline and foresight of its ruler, while maintaining a calm, observable rhythm that structured both ceremonial and practical life. Montezuma II's reign, observed through this lens, presents a portrait of power as stewardship rather than spectacle. His authority rested upon careful observation, deliberation, and a sense of cosmic and civic responsibility. The grandeur of Tenochtitlan, its temples, markets, canals, and causeways, was mirrored by the quiet diligence of administration, inspection, and ritual observance. The emperor's focus on precision and formality allowed the empire to function smoothly, even as it reached the limits of its structural and geographic capacity. In this period, the empire stood as a testament to human organization, observation, and adaptation. It was a world in which ritual reinforced governance, where local autonomy supported central authority, and where the ruler's introspection shaped both policy and perception. Calmly, the Mexica of Tenochtitlan maintained the rhythms of city, province, and tributary, demonstrating that empire was as much a matter of measured attention and subtle influence as of wealth or conquest. And just beyond the horizon, unfamiliar sails would soon appear. What quiet signs hint that a world is about to change forever? In the years leading up to 1519, Tenochtitlan stood as the vibrant heart of Mesoamerica. The city's canals reflected the morning light, markets thrummed with the exchange of maize, cacao, obsidian, and textiles, and temples echoed with the steady rhythm of ritual. Beyond the lakes, the empire's reach extended across mountains, valleys, and coasts, forming a network of tribute, trade, and diplomacy that was both intricate and resilient. Yet, beneath this apparent stability, subtle signs suggested that the world of the Mexica was on the cusp of profound change. Trade routes connected distant regions with remarkable efficiency. Merchants, the Pactica, traveled for months at a time, carrying goods and news from Oaxaca, the Gulf Coast, and the Western Highlands. Their journeys were not simply economic. They were also diplomatic, enabling communication between Tenochtitlan and subject polities. Along the coasts, reports filtered inland. Strangers had been sighted by fishermen and coastal communities, their vessels unlike any previously seen. These observations reached the capital slowly, recorded in codices and communicated through networks of merchants and envoys, forming a quiet awareness of the wider world beyond the empire's borders. Political tensions persisted alongside economic activity. Neighboring Itzcoatl maintained independence, negotiated alliances, and occasionally rebelled against tribute demands. Tenochtitlan's administrators were attentive, noting each fluctuation in loyalty and influence. Tribute collectors, scribes, and officials observed patterns of compliance, dispute, and negotiation, ensuring that the empire remained coherent despite its diversity. These subtle checks and balances reflected a system refined over generations, a combination of observation, record-keeping, and calibrated intervention that sustained cohesion across varied regions. The empire's reach extended across diverse ecological zones. In highland valleys, maize terraces and obsidian mines provided staples and raw materials. Along the Gulf Coast, cacao groves and tropical produce enriched both markets and ritual life. In semi-arid western regions, traders transported shells, precious stones, and textiles, binding distant lands to Tenochtitlan's rhythm. These varied environments demanded attentiveness. Seasonal rainfall, river cycles, and soil fertility shaped tribute obligations, campaign planning, and settlement maintenance. The empire's administrators quietly monitored these conditions, blending empirical observation with the ceremonial calendars that governed ritual and civic life. Daily life continued in its intricate rhythm. Schools taught boys and girls the knowledge and skills needed for civic and military life. Markets carried goods both mundane and luxurious. Temples held festivals that structured time and reinforced civic cohesion. The emperor's court, under Montezuma II, maintained ritualized authority, while scribes and inspectors ensured that tribute and administration operated smoothly. This world, appearing stable and ordered, was nevertheless poised on the edge of unforeseen transformation. Reports of distant lands reached the Mexica with gradual subtlety. Coastal communities spoke of foreign vessels with strange shapes, unfamiliar sails, and new faces. While these accounts were initially fragmentary, they circulated through networks of merchants, envoys, and coastal rulers. The information was absorbed quietly, noted by officials, and interpreted through familiar cosmologies and political logic. These early glimpses hinted at worlds beyond known borders, lands rich in resources, yet distant, mysterious, and capable of altering existing relationships. The Paktika played a dual role in this period, both as economic agents and as conduits of knowledge. Their journeys carried not only goods but intelligence about political shifts, unusual visitors, and environmental conditions in neighboring regions. As the Mexica observed these reports, they assessed potential threats, opportunities, and alliances with a combination of caution and pragmatism. Trade and intelligence were inseparable, forming a network of observation that extended the empire's awareness far beyond the lakes of the Valley of Mexico. A calm discovery of this period is the empire's delicate balance between expansion and administration. Even as tribute flowed, markets thrived, and ceremonies structured life, Tenochtitlan remained aware of the fragility inherent in vast networks. Each distant region carried its own customs, expectations, and potential for disruption. Observers in the capital monitored compliance and loyalty, adjusting tribute, oversight, and ceremonial attention as needed. The empire was a living system, sensitive to both natural and human variation, maintained through continuous observation rather than coercion alone. The pre-contact period also reveals the depth of cultural interconnection. Artifacts from distant lands, jade, feathers, shells, and textiles circulated throughout markets and ceremonial spaces. Poetic traditions, musical forms, and ritual innovations traveled alongside these goods, enriching both central and peripheral communities. Knowledge, like tribute, became a thread that wove the empire together. In this way, the Mexica maintained cohesion across linguistic, ecological, and cultural diversity, preparing a society capable of integrating complexity with quiet discipline. As the empire approached its zenith, its leaders remained attentive to internal pressures and external intelligence. Succession, tribute obligations, and regional alliances demanded careful oversight. Reports of strangers along the coast were noted, catalogued, and discussed within the emperor's councils. The empire's extensive bureaucratic apparatus allowed these observations to be absorbed into the broader understanding of risk, opportunity, and cosmic order. From this calm observation emerged preparedness, not panic, a reflective management of potential change before it reached the capital. In these years, one can sense the quiet prelude to transformation. Markets and temples, canals and causeways, codices and tribute lists all continued their steady rhythm. Yet in coastal reports, merchant accounts, and scribal records, subtle hints emerged that the Mexico world was about to encounter forces previously unimagined. The empire's systems were robust, yet no human or city could fully anticipate the magnitude of the encounter to come. This calm awareness, documented through observation and record-keeping, formed the final layer of preparation in an empire already stretched across diverse lands. By reflecting on these observations, one appreciates the fragility within stability. Tenochtitlan's splendor was the product of centuries of careful expansion, administration, and ritual integration. Its citizens were accustomed to rhythm, observation, and disciplined life. Yet, even the most well-ordered systems could not fully prepare a civilization for sudden, unforeseen contact. The subtle signs along the periphery, the distant sails, the unusual shapes of foreign vessels, the accounts of coastal observers, hinted that the world of the Mexica was about to enter a new chapter. And then, in the year 1519, strangers stepped ashore. What did two leaders see in one another when they first exchanged glances? In 1519, the waters and shores of the Gulf Coast bore witness to the quiet arrival of strange vessels. Small wooden ships, their sails unfamiliar to eyes accustomed to canoes and reed rafts, anchored near settlements whose inhabitants paused to observe with curiosity, caution, and cautious calculation. Hernán Cortés, leading a contingent of Spanish soldiers, brought with him the weight of an unfamiliar world: horses, steel, and iron-tipped weapons, objects both beautiful and incomprehensible to the peoples of Mesoamerica. Yet the first impressions were not immediate confrontation. They were measured, careful observation from both sides. Early encounters along the coast emphasized diplomacy and tentative engagement. The Spaniards sought alliances with local polities who, like the Totonacs and later the Tlaxcalans, had their own histories of tension and tribute obligations. These communities, aware of the Mexica's expansive power, weighed opportunity against caution, welcoming foreign arms and expertise as potential instruments in their local rivalries. In these moments, the Mexica themselves remained absent, their influence and presence noted only through rumor and reports carried by merchants and emissaries. The journey inland unfolded slowly, along rivers and over rough terrain, with both Spanish and indigenous groups negotiating passage, food, and safe lodging. Cortés relied on interpreters, most famously La Malinche, who became a bridge between two languages, two cultures, and two understandings of authority. Through this careful communication, the Spaniards began to comprehend local politics, while indigenous leaders assessed the intentions, strengths, and weaknesses of these newcomers. Both sides observed, recorded, and reflected, creating a mutual awareness that would shape the coming months. By the time the expedition reached Tlaxcala, one of the region's most formidable independent states, diplomacy had matured into strategic alliance. The Tlaxcalans, historically resistant to Mexican tribute demands, recognized the opportunity to shift the balance of power in their favor. They provided warriors, guides, and knowledge of the terrain, integrating the Spanish force into the local geopolitical landscape. Cortés, in turn, treated this alliance with care, honoring agreements and demonstrating restraint where possible, aware that his small contingent depended upon local support for survival and eventual success. When the expedition finally approached Tenochtitlan, the city rose from the lakes like a vision, its temples reflecting the sun, canals and causeways creating a rhythm of movement, and markets humming with life. Montezuma, too, informed of these strangers, welcomed envoys with ceremony, curiosity, and measured caution. The Mexica emperor had inherited a world meticulously observed and carefully administered, and he approached this unexpected arrival with the same reflective attention. Gifts were exchanged, ambassadors received, and initial assessments were made. The meeting of Cortés and Montezuma II is often recounted as dramatic, yet when approached calmly, it can be understood as a moment of mutual observation and diplomacy. Each leader assessed the other's appearance, speech, and bearing. Cortés noted the authority conveyed through the emperor's posture, attire, and attendance. Montezuma observed the unfamiliar garments, weapons, and gestures of the strangers. Both measured potential threats and possibilities, aware that their decisions could reverberate far beyond the immediate moment. There was curiosity, calculation, and a subtle recognition of power, yet also a deliberate caution that allowed dialogue, gift exchange, and ceremony to unfold without immediate conflict. A calm discovery of this first contact is the complexity of initial alliances. Neither side approached the meeting with naive trust. Each interpreted the gestures of the other through the lens of experience, culture, and expectation. The Spaniards understood the strategic importance of local alliances and ceremonial deference, while the Mexica evaluated these strangers against a lifetime of observing neighbors, tribute demands, and diplomatic signals. In this subtle interplay, the foundations for both cooperation and tension were quietly laid. Trade, tribute, and diplomacy shaped the early days of interaction. Gifts carried symbolic weight. Spanish metals and cloth impressed the Mexica, while gold, cacao, and textiles communicated wealth, status, and adherence to protocol. These exchanges were not superficial. They were instruments through which each side communicated intention, respect, and hierarchy. Observing the nuances of these interactions, both leaders could interpret potential outcomes and adjust their approach accordingly. The Spaniards also relied on observation and intelligence to navigate the social and political landscape. Cortés chroniclers later described meetings with local leaders, assessments of Tenochtitlan's defenses, and the intricate network of tributary obligations. Yet these records, often viewed as dramatic or sensational, can also be read calmly as meticulous documentation, the gathering of knowledge before decisions, an understanding of local rhythms, and careful attention to what might otherwise be overlooked. Montezuma, too, for his part, approached these strangers as he had long approached emissaries and envoys from neighboring Itzcoatl. He combined ceremonial recognition with analytical observation, carefully recording details, interpreting gestures, and weighing reports from his advisors. His calm authority allowed both negotiation and reflection, a testament to his understanding that appearances, rituals, and measured response could sustain stability even in the face of unprecedented novelty. Through these early encounters, one can appreciate the delicate interplay of diplomacy, perception, and circumstance. The Spanish were neither immediately conquerors nor allies in the conventional sense. The Mexica were neither immediately threatened nor complacent. Both sides moved within a space of observation, measured response, and quiet calculation. This period, often overshadowed by later violence, demonstrates the slow unfolding of understanding that preceded dramatic events. A calm, intricate dance of knowledge, strategy, and human curiosity. By reflecting on this period, we see that first contact was as much about perception as about power. Cortés learned to respect the organization, ritual, and scale of Tenochtitlan. Montezuma too learned to assess the technology, alliances, and ambitions of the Spaniards. Both leaders understood that appearances, gestures, and information carried meaning far beyond their immediate moment. In this quiet interplay, the empire confronted the first signs of a world that would soon challenge everything it had built. Even within the controlled ceremonial encounters, subtle tensions existed. Each gift, phrase, and gesture carried layered significance, interpreted in multiple ways. Missteps could provoke offense or misunderstanding, yet careful observation and patience allowed the meetings to proceed without immediate violence. This calm attention to nuance exemplifies the Mexica approach to governance, diplomacy, and empire, principles tested in extraordinary circumstances. The prelude to conflict, then, was not sudden. It was gradual, layered, and carefully observed, a series of assessments, alliances, and symbolic interactions. By understanding this, we see a Tenochtitlan that was vibrant, confident, and alert, an empire operating at the height of its organizational sophistication, yet beginning to encounter forces beyond its previous experience. Every observation, every gift, and every counsel contributed to a web of understanding that would, in time, be challenged by the unpredictability of human ambition and circumstance. But peace in such moments rarely lasts. How does a fragile balance finally crack? The fragile equilibrium between Tenochtitlan and the newcomers began to unravel quietly, almost imperceptibly, before spilling into open conflict. Cortés' presence, initially approached with cautious diplomacy, slowly revealed underlying tensions. The Spaniards, reliant on their indigenous allies, navigated both opportunity and uncertainty, while Montezuma II's court struggled to interpret intentions, maintain authority, and preserve civic order. What began as observation and negotiation shifted into a delicate, high-stakes game in which miscalculation or misinterpretation could ripple across the lakes and causeways. One of the earliest and most consequential events occurred at Cholula, a city south of the Valley of Mexico. Cortés and his allies, seeking to secure the route toward Tenochtitlan, encountered a city steeped in its own political complexity. Cholula's rulers, long accustomed to negotiating allegiances and tribute, offered apparent hospitality. Yet the Spaniards, suspicious of potential ambush, acted preemptively. In the calm recounting of events, It is possible to see the tension between caution, mistrust, and strategic necessity. A massacre unfolded, leaving many dead and sending a clear signal to surrounding polities. For observers, the event was not about spectacle, but about the fragile calculus of security and fear. Montezuma II, aware of the Spaniards' growing influence and the uncertainties introduced by their Tlaxcalan allies, continued to engage in ceremonial diplomacy, even as the city's council debated response. The emperor's restraint reflected both his personality and a strategic understanding. Appearances and ritual could stabilize perception, allowing time for reflection. Yet beneath the ceremonial surface, anxiety permeated the nobility and populace. Reports of Cholula, combined with the foreigners' increasing demands, created a tension that stretched both governance and patience. Soon, the Spanish and their allies entered Tenochtitlan under a guise of ceremony. They were welcomed with gifts, processions, and formal audiences. Yet even within these controlled gestures, control was subtly shifting. Cortés and his men began to assert influence over court proceedings, observe the city's defenses, and interpret the loyalties of nobles and commoners alike. The Mexica, in turn, observed the strangers with care, noting their technology, alliances, and intentions. This observation, initially mutual and measured, slowly became overshadowed by mistrust and the realization that true parity was impossible. The decisive breach came when Montezuma II himself was seized. The emperor, confined within his own palace, became both a symbolic and practical instrument of Spanish control. Calmly considered, this act was not the result of immediate rage or improvisation. It was a deliberate step to leverage political stability, reduce the possibility of rebellion, and use the emperor's authority to influence the city. For the Mexica, this moment was psychologically profound. The sacred king, the linchpin of ritual and civic order, was suddenly removed from autonomy. Civic routines continued, but their underlying rhythm had changed. Even as diplomacy faltered, everyday life in Tenochtitlan persisted. Markets, gardens, and workshops remained active, yet the underlying anxiety touched every corner. Citizens and officials navigated uncertainty. How to maintain obligations to the emperor, to the city, and to their own neighborhoods when authority itself seemed compromised. Through calm observation, one sees not chaos alone, but a society striving to preserve its internal coherence under unprecedented pressure. This period also reveals the subtle human dimensions of tension. The emotions of leaders, advisors, and citizens, curiosity, anxiety, hope, and doubt, interwove with the material realities of power. Cortés' cautious commands, the Tlaxcalan warriors' presence, and Montezuma II's constrained influence created a complex tapestry in which each participant's understanding and decision-making shaped outcomes. The shift from observation to confrontation was not sudden, but the accumulation of pressure, misinterpretation, and competing imperatives. Strategically, the Spaniards sought to secure the city and neutralize potential resistance, while the Mexica attempted to interpret these maneuvers within familiar frameworks of diplomacy, tribute, and ritual. Both sides acted within a logic of survival and leverage, yet each step introduced new risks. Every decision, from movement along the canals to the placement of guards, contributed to a slowly intensifying tension that made violent confrontation increasingly probable. A calm discovery of this period lies in the interdependence of ritual, authority, and perception. The seizure of Montezuma II was not merely a military action. It was a manipulation of symbolic and social structures. By controlling the emperor, the Spaniards sought to influence civic perception, demonstrating how deeply political authority in Tenochtitlan depended on both visibility and ritual legitimacy. For contemporary observers, this offers insight into the nuanced interplay between psychological, ceremonial, and structural dimensions of governance. Through the weeks and months that followed, diplomatic exchanges continued under duress. Gifts, messages, and ceremonies persisted, yet the underlying calculus had shifted. The Mexica could not fully reverse the Spaniards' presence, while the Spanish relied upon their allies and the controlled influence of Montezuma II. In these interactions, one sees the slow unraveling of equilibrium, a combination of strategic maneuvering, emotional strain, and structural vulnerability that would soon culminate in open conflict. The stage was thus set for siege and resistance. Montezuma II's constrained authority, the Spanish alliances with discontented polities, and the city's intricate networks of causeways and canals created a scenario in which the consequences of misstep were enormous. Yet the unfolding was not immediate chaos. It was a gradual escalation, a series of careful, tense calculations and measured responses. Each action, observed and recorded, contributed to the inexorable drift toward confrontation. Finally, one observes that this period embodies both resilience and vulnerability. Tenochtitlan's civic and ritual systems continued to operate under stress, illustrating the depth of social cohesion. Yet these same systems depended upon the presence of a central authority whose autonomy had been compromised. The subtle cracks in perception, loyalty, and communication demonstrate that even the most sophisticated social structures can face existential risk when external and internal pressures converge. And soon, the city itself would face its final test. What does a city feel like when the tide of fate turns against it? On the evening of July 1st, 1520, Tenochtitlan experienced a moment that would echo through history as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. The city, normally vibrant with the gentle rhythm of water, markets, and ritual, became the silent stage for sudden turmoil. Calmly considering the unfolding events, one can perceive not only the violence but the profound psychological weight borne by both the inhabitants and the invaders. Streets and canals, usually conduits of commerce and communication, transformed into narrow corridors of fear and urgency. Cortés and his men, accompanied by Tlaxcalan allies, attempted a retreat under the cover of darkness. The Mexica, interpreting the movement as an opportunity to resist, struck strategically along the canals and causeways. Though the encounter involved armed confrontation, the narrative need not dramatize spectacle. It can be understood as a complex interplay of movement, decision, and circumstance. Canoes overturned, bridges were cut, and the rhythm of the city itself seemed to shift under the weight of human tension. In the aftermath, Spanish and indigenous casualties were significant. Soldiers, horses, and supplies were lost to the waters. The retreat was painstaking and chaotic. Yet this loss, viewed calmly, also illustrates the challenges of logistics and navigation in a city so intimately connected with water. The causeways, canals, and marshes that had supported trade and movement became obstacles under duress, reminding observers that geography can be both friend and foe. The Mexica, despite the chaos of the night, faced their own mixture of triumph and apprehension. The city had defended itself successfully in this immediate moment, yet the presence of foreign armies, allied polities, and the continued captivity of Montezuma II created persistent tension. The population, citizens, warriors, and nobles navigated grief, fear, and uncertainty, while maintaining the structures of daily life wherever possible. Markets reopened, water canals were cleared, and ritual schedules were recalibrated to reflect the new reality. A calm discovery of this period is the resilience of urban systems. Despite sudden disruption, Tenochtitlan's administrative and civic networks allowed the city to recover from immediate shock. Bridges were repaired, messages relayed, and military preparations undertaken with deliberate attention. The Mexica had long managed complex networks of canals, causeways, and districts. These structures, designed for both everyday function and strategic defense, now served to sustain life amid crisis. Meanwhile, Cortés and his allies regrouped outside the city. Supply lines were reconstructed, strategic alliances reassessed, and morale rebuilt through careful leadership. The Spanish recognized that immediate triumph was impossible, and they proceeded with measured planning rather than rash pursuit. Their reflection and adjustment demonstrate a parallel resilience. Even after severe loss, strategy and patience could maintain cohesion and enable future action. The following months became a period of quiet preparation and strategic recalibration. Cortés strengthened alliances with the Tlaxcalans and other neighboring polities, reinforcing both his numbers and intelligence networks. The Mexica, aware of the foreign presence and the internal vulnerabilities posed by rebellion and siege, also prepared, maintaining vigilance while attempting to continue civic and ceremonial routines. These months illustrate the slow, deliberate unfolding of military and social strategy, an interplay of observation, calculation, and endurance. An additional observation is the psychological dimension of siege and uncertainty. For the citizens of Tenochtitlan, every moment carried heightened awareness. Movement along the canals, the presence of armed foreigners in neighboring settlements, and reports of distant battles all contributed to collective tension. Yet life continued, and the Mexica maintained practices that reinforced identity, cohesion, and resilience. Markets, gardens, and ritual spaces adapted to circumstances, providing continuity even as the threat of renewed conflict loomed. La Noche Triste, then, is not solely a story of loss. It is also a testament to adaptation under pressure. Both the city and its adversaries learned the necessity of planning, patience, and observation. Civilians, warriors, and leaders alike engaged in ongoing assessment, adjusting movements, fortifications, and resource allocation to meet emerging challenges. The calm narrative highlights the human ability to respond thoughtfully, even in moments of apparent disaster. Through this reflective lens, one can see that the siege was already taking shape in these quiet days of preparation. Stockpiles were readied, causeways reinforced, and alliances solidified. Both sides anticipated that the coming months would test strategy, endurance, and willpower. The Mexica understood that defending Tenochtitlan required not only courage but meticulous attention to supply, communication, and morale. The Spanish and their allies similarly recognized the need for careful coordination and timing, rather than reliance on impulse. Finally, the period following La Noche Triste reminds us that collapse is rarely instantaneous. It is a process that unfolds through tension, recalibration, and the slow accumulation of pressure. Tenochtitlan's citizens, Cortés and his allies, and the surrounding polities all engaged in measured adaptation, preparing, observing, and adjusting. In this way, the Night of Sorrows becomes not only an episode of immediate loss, but a moment in a broader narrative of endurance, strategy, and the inexorable march toward a defining test of the city's strength. And the siege began. How long can a city endure when the circle around it tightens each day? The siege of Tenochtitlan unfolded over 13 weeks, a period marked less by sudden spectacle than by the quiet, cumulative pressure of encirclement, scarcity, and relentless observation. The city, once alive with the rhythm of markets, gardens, and canals, found its pulse measured against the slow tightening of external forces. The Spaniards and their allies, controlling surrounding causeways and monitoring water routes, gradually restricted movement, while the Mexica confronted the growing reality of isolation. In this calm retelling, one sees the siege as an intricate interplay of geography, logistics, and human endurance. The canals and causeways that had once facilitated trade and communication became conduits of vulnerability. Bridges were destroyed or controlled, water transport was limited, and the movement of goods, people, and information slowed to a deliberate pace. The Mexica, experienced in urban organization, sought to maintain order under these new constraints, distributing food and coordinating defenses with the tools and knowledge at their disposal. Famine began to creep quietly through the city. The chinampa fields, so productive in times of peace, could no longer be cultivated or fully accessed. Fishing, once reliable along the lake's shores, was constrained by constant surveillance and military presence. The narrative here is not one of dramatized suffering, but of gradual deprivation, the erosion of everyday sustenance, measured in empty granaries, shortened meals, and the slow calculus of survival. Families adapted, sharing resources and modifying routines, yet the strain was undeniable. Disease, introduced both through the Spaniards and through the stress of confinement, compounded the city's challenges. Smallpox, unfamiliar to the Mexica population, spread quietly but lethally, altering the demographic and social landscape. The illness did not erupt as a singular moment of horror. It moved steadily, affecting households, neighborhoods, and military units alike. Citizens, priests, and warriors alike confronted loss and uncertainty, yet continued to fulfill obligations to family, community, and ritual whenever possible. Despite these pressures, resistance continued with remarkable organization. The Mexica maintained fortifications along the main causeways, coordinated sorties against besieging forces, and adapted tactics to both defend and conserve strength. Observers could note the careful use of resources, the rotation of defenders, and the communication along canals, strategies that reflected a city's intimate understanding of its own infrastructure. Each act of resistance, however small, exemplified endurance under constraint rather than reckless heroism. Political leadership, though strained, remained active. The nobility and remaining officials coordinated strategy, communicated with neighborhoods, and maintained ceremonial duties to preserve social cohesion. Even as the emperor's authority had been compromised months earlier, civic structures continued to mediate between governance and survival. This period reveals the subtle interdependence of society, ritual, and urban infrastructure. Each element relied on the other to sustain a fragile continuity under siege. Trade, which once extended across Mesoamerica, ceased almost entirely. The Paktika, the long-distance merchants who had carried goods and news from distant regions, could no longer enter or leave. Foreign goods, gifts, and news became scarce, isolating the city not only physically but culturally. Yet the Mexica adapted, relying on local production and knowledge, adjusting their social and economic practices to the severe constraints imposed from outside. A calm reflection on this period is the quiet ingenuity of urban survival. Households developed systems to collect rainwater, ration food, and maintain basic hygiene. Workshops produced necessary tools and implements, while neighborhood councils coordinated communal efforts. Observers might note how ordinary routines persisted, though altered, providing continuity in a context dominated by scarcity. In this sense, the siege was as much a test of social and logistical intelligence as it was of military strength. The Spaniards, too, approached the siege with deliberate care. Recognizing the difficulties of maintaining forces on distant causeways and canals, they coordinated supply lines, monitored water traffic, and leveraged alliances to pressure the city without overextending their own position. The careful pacing, calculation of resources, and use of allied forces reflect a strategy rooted in observation and measured action rather than spontaneous aggression. Throughout the 13 weeks, the city itself bore witness to endurance and transformation. The familiar sounds of Tenochtitlan, canoes gliding across canals, the hum of market negotiations, and the ritual calls from temples were muffled or altered. Yet within this altered soundscape, life continued. Families cooked together, children moved cautiously through neighborhoods, and priests maintained cycles of prayer and ceremony. The siege, in this reflective view, was not only a military event but a profound test of urban resilience and cultural continuity. An additional insight lies in the interplay of environment and strategy. The lakes, once protective and sustaining, now constrained movement. Mud and rain complicated both defense and supply. Causeways, once lifelines, became choke points. The Mexica leveraged their knowledge of terrain to resist encirclement as effectively as possible, while the attackers adjusted to these constraints with careful planning. Observing these adaptations offers insight into how geography and human ingenuity intersect during moments of prolonged pressure. Finally, the cumulative effect of famine, disease, and infrastructure disruption gradually eroded the city's ability to sustain prolonged resistance. The siege's slow rhythm allowed observers, both contemporary and modern, to see how societal endurance is bounded not only by morale, but by resources, health, and the physical environment. By the end of 13 weeks, Tenochtitlan's urban systems, though resilient, were exhausted. In this calm reflection, the siege is not merely a story of conquest or defeat, but of human adaptation and structural limits. The city's efforts to feed, defend, and govern itself under encirclement reveal both the sophistication of Aztec urban organization and the inevitability of pressure applied from multiple directions. Tenochtitlan's endurance during these weeks embodies the delicate balance between resourcefulness and vulnerability, preparation and contingency. And when the smoke cleared, another world began to form. What pieces of a fallen world quietly remain after the dust settles? After the conquest, the landscape of the Valley of Mexico was forever altered, yet it did not fall into emptiness. Tenochtitlan, the island city that had once pulsed with the rhythms of markets, canals, and ceremonial life, became the foundation upon which the Spanish rebuilt their new capital, Mexico City. Calmly viewed through the lens of history, the transformation was not abrupt erasure, but a layered process in which indigenous structures, knowledge, and practices persisted beneath and alongside European forms. The Spanish planners imposed a grid of streets, plazas, and churches over the island, yet much of the underlying urban fabric, the causeways, canals, and chinampa fields, remained essential for daily life. Waterways continued to support transport and irrigation, while neighborhood divisions, or calpulli, were adapted into parishes and municipal wards. In this way, the rhythms of daily living endured, quietly shaping the new city even under foreign rule. Markets, too, persisted with remarkable continuity. Indigenous merchants continued to sell maize, beans, cacao, and textiles, often alongside Spanish goods and European imports. The Pactica traditions of long-distance trade evolved, intersecting with new colonial routes while preserving familiar techniques of negotiation, exchange, and social interaction. Observing this calm coexistence, one sees that economic networks are resilient, often surviving transformations of political authority without losing their underlying logic. Chinampa agriculture, the floating gardens that had sustained Tenochtitlan's population for centuries, remained a vital part of the valley's sustenance. Farmers adapted to new rulers, new crops, and new regulations. Yet the ingenuity of raised fields, canals, and crop rotation continued to support the city. The continuity of food production illustrates a broader principle. Even after cataclysmic political change, human ingenuity and environmental knowledge endure quietly, providing stability amid transformation. Spanish authorities imposed tribute, labor drafts, and new religious frameworks, yet these impositions were negotiated and adapted locally. Indigenous municipalities preserved elements of traditional governance. Councils continued to mediate disputes, local leaders retained limited authority, and ritual calendars were maintained privately or subtly incorporated into colonial festivals. In this way, social and cultural memory survived in forms visible and hidden, blending resilience with adaptation. The calm reconstruction also allowed for architectural layering. Temples were dismantled or repurposed. Stones from the Templo Mayor were incorporated into churches and public buildings. To modern eyes, these acts might seem acts of erasure, yet they also demonstrate the persistence of material memory. The stones, like echoes, carry traces of past ceremonies, inscriptions, and human labor. Observing these continuities invites reflection on how history is rarely completely lost. It is reshaped, reinterpreted, and carried forward in tangible form. Daily life among the surviving Mexica reflected this balance of change and continuity. Families preserved cooking methods, weaving techniques, and agricultural routines. Children learned both Spanish and Nahuatl, navigating dual cultural landscapes. Artisans combined traditional iconography with European motifs, producing codices, ceramics, and textiles that quietly bridged worlds. Through these practices, the knowledge, aesthetics, and social structures of the Aztec world persisted, even under the shadow of conquest. A calm discovery of this period lies in the persistence of human networks. Neighborhood councils, kinship ties, trade relationships, and ritual knowledge all provided continuity. These networks mediated the tension between old and new, offering citizens a sense of identity and stability amid profound change. They illustrate that culture is not only embedded in buildings or empires but flows through people, practices, and shared understanding. Religion, too, found continuity in subtle forms. While the Catholic Church became the public center of spiritual life, indigenous beliefs and cosmologies persisted privately, often integrated into Christian observances or local festivals. The Aztec understanding of cyclical time, celestial observation, and ritual obligation influenced how communities organized work, ceremony, and communal memory. In this way, spiritual continuity coexisted with colonial authority, forming a layered landscape of faith and practice. Finally, the rebuilding of Tenochtitlan into Mexico City exemplifies a broader theme: the endurance of human adaptation. Political dominion may shift, buildings may be repurposed, and rulers replaced. Yet the pulse of daily life, markets, gardens, education, and ritual, carries forward, quietly linking past and present. Observers can trace lines of continuity in water management, urban planning, and social organization, seeing how knowledge, labor, and memory survive even under dramatic change. But memory endures in more than stones. How does a culture continue speaking even when its world has been transformed? Even as political control shifted, the Nahua people continued to carry forward the essence of their culture, preserving language, ritual, and collective memory through quiet, deliberate acts. Codices, painted manuscripts recording genealogy, tribute, ritual cycles, and cosmological knowledge, served as repositories of wisdom. Many were hidden, copied, or adapted under Spanish oversight, yet they ensured that the Mexico world could still speak through ink and pigment. These codices are more than records. They are a calm echo of thought, law, and spiritual practice reaching across generations. Language itself became both shield and bridge. Nahuatl, the tongue of the Mexica, survived through households, marketplaces, and community ceremonies. Children learned it alongside Spanish, creating a linguistic continuity that allowed stories, prayers, and songs to persist. In this way, even as plazas and temples were reshaped, the living voice of a people quietly resisted erasure. Words became vessels of identity, linking past customs to future generations in a flow as steady as the lake waters surrounding Tenochtitlan. Rituals, too, endured in subtle forms. Seasonal festivals, agricultural rites, and personal devotions were sometimes adapted, sometimes hidden, yet always performed with attention to memory and meaning. The cycles of planting and harvest, the veneration of ancestors, and the observance of celestial events continued, not with public grandeur, but in households, small shrines, and community gatherings. In these acts, the Mexica preserved their understanding of time, order, and cosmic balance, a spiritual continuity that transcended conquest. Artistic traditions provided another channel of survival. Ceramics, textiles, weaving, and codex painting combined pre-Hispanic motifs with new materials and influences, producing forms that were simultaneously adaptive and faithful. Music, poetry, and oral storytelling also persisted. Poets and singers recited lines that had been passed down, ensuring that philosophy, memory, and metaphor continued to enrich life. Even subtle gestures, a patterned cloth, a rhythm in song, a ceremonial offering, served as quiet affirmations of identity. A calm discovery emerges when observing community resilience. Across villages and neighborhoods, kinship networks, local councils, and guilds maintained a shared sense of order and belonging. Festivals might shift in scale, marketplaces adapt to colonial regulations, and rituals blend with imposed Christian forms, but the underlying logic of social cohesion and memory remained. Knowledge was transmitted with patience, in ways that did not rely on empire or spectacle, but on human continuity. Through these avenues, the Nahua world spoke across time. Codices preserved law and lore, language carried memory, rituals maintained cosmology, and art and poetry expressed the subtleties of thought and emotion. These voices remind us that culture is not solely a matter of cities, armies, or rulers, but resides in the practices, words, and attention of ordinary people. Even when empires fall, the living echoes of identity endure, quietly shaping the landscapes of mind and heart. And so we look back, across the lakes. What lessons linger when we listen softly to the past? In the centuries since Tenochtitlan fell, the Aztec world has continued to speak, not through conquest or empire, but through archaeology, scholarship, and the patient attention of those who study its traces. Excavations along the lakebeds reveal causeways, temples, and the delicate remains of Chinampa gardens, each a quiet testimony to human ingenuity. Codices, inscriptions, and oral traditions have allowed historians, anthropologists, and linguists to reconstruct the rhythms of daily life, the cycles of ritual, and the intricate networks of governance that once sustained millions. Modern understanding reframes the Aztecs not as mere symbols of conquest, but as a civilization whose knowledge, artistry, and organization influenced the Americas profoundly. Scholars trace their mathematical and astronomical insights, the precision of their calendars, and the sophistication of their urban planning. From causeways that bridged islands to the floating gardens that fed a thriving metropolis, these features reveal careful design, observation, and adaptation to complex environments. Each discovery allows us to see not only structures but the people who built, maintained, and inhabited them. Equally compelling is the way memory persists in culture. Festivals, language, and artisanal practices in modern Mexico carry echoes of Nahua thought and creativity. Music, poetry, and storytelling preserve frameworks of understanding that predate conquest, reminding us that culture endures even when political structures do not. Anthropologists note that in villages and urban neighborhoods alike, the threads of Aztec tradition, woven into daily life, ritual, and craft, create continuity, a living connection to a past that might otherwise seem distant. Archaeology and scholarship, however, are not only about what remains, but about how we interpret it. Early narratives often simplified or sensationalized Aztec life. Modern approaches aim for calm, precise, and contextually rich understandings. By considering environmental adaptation, political strategy, and social complexity, historians can approach the Aztec world on its own terms, not through the lens of outside expectation. Each new finding, a codex, a ceremonial site, a botanical study of Chinampas, adds nuance, allowing the civilization's story to emerge with quiet clarity. There is also a reflective lesson in endurance. Despite conquest, disease, and cultural imposition, the intellectual and spiritual legacy of the Aztecs survives. Modern Mexico's language, civic organization, and identity are shaped by centuries of Nahua influence. The city itself, now Mexico City, sits upon the same islands, lakes, and foundations of Tenochtitlan, a living palimpsest where history layers upon itself. One can walk its streets and glimpse echoes of past urban life, a calm reminder that human effort leaves traces that transcend time. Finally, the Aztec story teaches us to observe the past with patience and empathy. By listening carefully to evidence, artifacts, landscapes, writings, and living memory, we gain not only knowledge, but a sense of continuity. The civilization is no longer distant myth or dramatic spectacle. It becomes a measured narrative of human ingenuity, community, and adaptation. The lessons are subtle. The importance of water and land management, the integration of ritual and governance, the resilience of social networks, and the enduring voice of culture. And with that, we bring this long journey to rest, a quiet farewell to the island city that once rose from the marsh. If the quiet echoes of Tenochtitlan have stirred your curiosity, consider subscribing to explore more lost worlds, ancient cities, and the rhythms of civilizations past. Share this journey with others who enjoy history told with calm reflection, and allow yourself to return anytime, to walk once more among the lakes, temples, and stories that still linger in memory.